The salty morning breeze carried the distinct scent of expensive coastal living, sweeping across the pristine balcony of the $4 million beachfront property. Kendra stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass windows, her posture perfectly straight, her eyes fixed on the winding driveway below. The digital clock on her kitchen counter shifted to exactly 9:55 in the morning, right on schedule. The grinding gears of a heavy commercial moving truck shattered the serene harmony of the crashing ocean waves. The massive vehicle idled at the base of the private gates, its diesel engine rumbling like a warning. This was not a surprise delivery. This was an invasion carefully anticipated and meticulously calculated. The sheer audacity of the impending confrontation sparked a cold, analytical thrill in Kendra's chest. For years, she had balanced ledgers, uncovered hidden assets, and tracked financial deceit as a forensic accountant. Today, she was balancing the scales of her own life. The gates swung open, granting access to the theater of their own destruction. Behind the moving truck, a sleek silver luxury SUV pulled up, parking haphazardly across the manicured cobblestones. The doors swung open, and the antagonists of Kendra's lifelong narrative stepped out into the California sun. First emerged Tasha the Golden Child, adjusting her oversized designer sunglasses and smoothing down a linen dress that screamed of unearned wealth. Following closely was Brad, Tasha's husband, sporting the ubiquitous uniform of a Silicon Valley grifter, a tailored fleece vest over a crisp button-down loafers without socks, and an aura of supreme, unmerited confidence. Finally, Brenda and Marcus, Kendra's parents, climbed out of the back seat. They carried themselves not like guests visiting their daughter, but like conquering monarchs arriving to claim their spoils. They hauled matching sets of expensive luggage from the trunk, their faces flushed with greedy excitement. They were a unified front of entitlement, marching in lockstep toward a prize they had done absolutely nothing to earn. Kendra watched them ascend the grand stone staircase leading to the main entrance. She did not retreat. She did not lock the heavy oak doors. Instead, she stepped out onto the expansive front porch, crossing her arms over her simple silk blouse. The morning sun illuminated the sharp, uncompromising lines of her face. She was the sole rightful owner of this estate, an inheritance granted by Great-Aunt Vivian, a woman who had seen through the family's shallow facade. Brad reached the top of the stairs first. He did not pause to greet Kendra. He did not offer a polite smile. His heavy leather loafer slammed down directly onto the center of Kendra's imported welcome mat, a deliberate act of disrespect designed to establish his dominance. He looked around the sweeping architectural curves of the porch and whistled, nodding in approval, as if inspecting a newly acquired warehouse. He turned his attention to Kendra, looking her up and down with a condescending smirk. He clapped his hands together, the sound sharp and grating. He told Kendra that it was time to stop playing house. He extended an open palm, wiggling his fingers in a demanding gesture, and explicitly ordered her to hand over the keys to the master suite immediately. He stated that Tasha was exhausted from the drive and needed to rest in the primary bedroom. Before Kendra could even process the demand, Brad continued his barrage of arrogant instructions. He casually informed her that she would need to clear out the ocean view study by noon. He declared that he required the space for his startup operations and suggested with a mocking laugh that Kendra could move her little home office down to the basement where the lighting was more suitable for a solitary accountant. Tasha stepped up beside her husband, linking her arm through his. She offered Kendra a saccharine, pitying smile, the kind reserved for a disappointing subordinate. Tasha loudly agreed with Brad, adding that a single woman with no children simply did not need 4 bedrooms and a panoramic view of the Pacific Ocean. Brenda and Marcus arrived right behind them, nodding in furious agreement. Brenda immediately began criticizing the landscaping, pointing at the imported agave plants and declaring they would need to be replaced with roses to suit Tasha's tastes. Marcus puffed out his chest, telling Kendra to be a good sister and start bringing the suitcases inside, reminding her that family always accommodates family. They spoke over her, around her, and through her, entirely convinced of their own false reality. They expected Kendra to shrink. They expected her to lower her head, apologize for taking up space, and hand over the keys to her sanctuary. They relied on the old dynamic, the lifelong script where Tasha received everything and Kendra received the scraps. Instead of stepping aside or raising her voice, Kendra displayed no anger or sadness. Rather, a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the smile of a predator, watching its prey willingly step into a steel trap. The absolute silence from Kendra finally caused the group to pause. Brad's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his outstretched hand still waiting for the keys. Kendra slowly uncrossed her arms. She reached into the pocket of her tailored trousers and retrieved a crisp, sharply folded legal document. She did not hand over a set of keys. She placed the heavy watermarked paper directly into Brad's open palm. She looked him dead in the eye, her voice steady, clear, and devoid of any familial warmth. She informed him that he was currently standing on private property without permission or invitation. She stated clearly that the document he was holding was a formal, legally binding trespassing notice. The heavy watermarked paper resting in Brad's open palm seemed to freeze the ambient air on the sprawling porch for a fraction of a second. He stared down at the black ink of the trespassing notice, as if it were an alien artifact, his brow furrowing in a display of genuine, unadulterated confusion. Then the confusion melted into a low, rumbling chuckle that quickly escalated into full-throated, mocking laughter. The sound was harsh, echoing off the expensive stonework of the estate and drowning out the gentle rhythm of the ocean waves crashing against the shoreline below. Brad shook his head, his perfectly styled hair barely moving in the coastal breeze. With a deliberate theatrical slowness, he brought his hands together and tore the legal document straight down the middle. He layered the torn halves and ripped them again, letting the shredded pieces of heavy stock paper flutter onto the pristine cobblestones near his expensive loafers. He took a step forward, invading Kendra's personal space, attempting to use his physical stature to force her into submission. He leaned in his face mere inches from hers, radiating an aura of impenetrable, aggressive entitlement. He spoke with the quiet, dangerous confidence of a man who had never faced a single consequence in his entire privileged existence. Hai told Kendra that her little power trip was over before it even began. He adjusted the collar of his tailored fleece vest, puffing out his chest as he delivered his verbal assault. He stated unequivocally that the sheer idea of a single childless accountant attempting to maintain a $4 million beachfront property was not just laughable, it was an insult to basic economics. He gestured broadly to the sweeping architecture, the imported agave plants, and the sprawling square footage of the estate, demanding to know how a lonely bean counter with no husband and no prospects planned to afford the property taxes, let alone the upkeep. He leaned heavily on his societal armor, weaponizing his gender and his race, with practiced ease projecting the absolute certainty that he inherently deserved this space more than she ever could. He declared that properties like this belonged to families, to visionaries, to people who built legacies and tech empires, not to bitter spinsters who spent their days staring at spreadsheets in solitary confinement. He informed her that her desperate attempt to claim ownership was pathetic, a sad manifestation of her jealousy toward Tasha's successful marriage and his own booming entrepreneurial career. Without breaking eye contact, Brad reached inside the breast pocket of his designer jacket. He retrieved a document of his own, folded neatly into thirds. He snapped it open with a sharp flick of his wrist, holding it up as if it were a holy relic guaranteed to banish Kendra from the premises. He smoothed out the creases with an air of absolute triumph. He proudly announced that what he held was the official legally binding property deed to the estate. According to his triumphant narrative, Great Aunt Vivian had experienced a moment of profound clarity during her final days in hospice care. Realizing the error of her ways, she had allegedly signed the entire property over to Brenda, the devoted matriarch of the family, right before she took her last breath. Brad's smile widened into a predatory grin as he explained the next step of this fictional legal journey. He stated that Brenda, being a loving and generous mother who prioritized the future of her lineage, had immediately gifted the estate to Tasha and Brad. He emphasized the words, growing family, dragging out the syllables to remind Kendra of her own childless status. He proclaimed that this house was meant for children, for a dynamic household, for a family that actually had a future worth investing in. Brenda could not contain herself any longer. Seeing the deed in Brad's hand emboldened her, washing away any lingering shred of maternal restraint. She pushed past her husband Marcus and stepped right up to Kendra, her face flushed red with righteous indignation. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Kendra's chest, her voice rising to a shrill, piercing pitch that commanded attention. Brenda unleashed a torrent of venom, scolding her youngest daughter for possessing the sheer audacity to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. She yelled that Kendra was acting entirely out of spite, driven by a deep-seated jealousy that had rotted her from the inside out since childhood. Brenda demanded that Kendra show some respect, insisting that Kendra owed this family an insurmountable debt of gratitude. The matriarch did not stop there. She leaned into her most potent weapon, weaponized guilt. Brenda loudly and proudly admitted to the financial sabotage that had defined Kendra's early adulthood. She aggressively reminded Kendra of the precise reason her college fund had suddenly vanished during her sophomore year of university. Brenda screamed that they had to drain every single cent of Kendra's tuition money to pay for Tasha and Brad's lavish over-the-top country club wedding. She described the extravagant ice sculptures, the imported orchids, and the top-tier catering without a single ounce of remorse. Instead, Brenda framed this theft as a necessary family sacrifice, screaming that they absolutely had to impress Brad's upper-class family and secure Tasha's place in high society. Brenda stated that Kendra's education was a small, insignificant price to pay for Tasha's elite matrimony. She demanded that Kendra stop being selfish, stop throwing a tantrum, and step aside so the real owners could move into their rightful home. Kendra remained perfectly still, absorbing the barrage of insults, the admission of financial abuse, and the aggressive posturing without blinking. Her expression did not falter. The forensic accountant inside her had already detached from the emotional chaos, her mind shifting into an entirely analytical gear. She did not look at her screaming mother or her smug sister. Her eyes were locked entirely on the document in Brad's hand. She reached out, her movements slow and deliberate, and gently took the paper from his grasp. Brad allowed it, his smirk indicating he believed he had finally won. As soon as the paper touched her fingers, Kendra's internal alarms triggered. The tactile feedback was immediately wrong. The paper stock was too thin, lacking the heavy textured weight of a genuine county-recorded deed. Her eyes scanned the text, noting the modern default word processor font that clashed horribly with the traditional formatting used by Aunt Vivian's longtime legal team. She observed the margins, the spacing, and the layout, instantly recognizing the hallmarks of a document hastily cobbled together on a home printer rather than drafted by a professional firm. Then her gaze dropped to the bottom of the page, settling on the signature and the notary stamp. A wave of cold satisfaction washed over her. Kendra looked up from the fraudulent paper. She did not yell back at her mother. She did not argue with Brad's assertions of supremacy. Instead, she offered Brad a slow, chilling smirk. It was a look of absolute, terrifying certainty. She tilted her head slightly, holding the fake deed up between them. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the lingering echoes of Brenda's screaming perfectly. She asked Brad with chilling sincerity if he was absolutely, unconditionally sure that he wanted to present this specific document to the authorities. She warned him that once this piece of paper was handed over to law enforcement, there was no turning back. Brad laughed again, a harsh, dismissive sound. He snatched the paper back from Kendra's hand, thoroughly convinced of his own invincibility. He looked at her with pure disdain, declaring that she had finally lost her mind. To prove his absolute dominance and to rid himself of this minor inconvenience once and for all, Brad reached into his pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone. He stared directly into Kendra's eyes, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. With a smug, victorious expression, Brad Hayes deliberately dialed 911, requesting immediate police assistance to remove a hostile trespasser from his property. The distant wail of police sirens began as a faint hum over the crashing ocean waves. Brad slipped his expensive smartphone back into the pocket of his tailored fleece vest. His chest puffed out in absolute triumph. The sound of the approaching authorities served as music to his ears, the ultimate validation of his unearned authority. He shot a smug, victorious glare toward Kendra, fully expecting her to crumble into a panic. Tasha immediately leaned into her husband, her face suddenly shifting from aggressive entitlement to a carefully orchestrated mask of distress. Brenda and Marcus stepped forward, positioning themselves defensively around their golden child and their wealthy son-in-law, forming a physical barrier against the imaginary threat their youngest daughter posed. The heavy iron gates at the base of the driveway remained open, allowing a sleek black and white patrol cruiser to ascend the manicured cobblestone path. The vehicle rolled to a smooth stop, right behind Brad's haphazardly parked silver luxury SUV. The flashing red and blue lights reflected wildly off the pristine glass windows of the $4 million beachfront estate, casting an erratic, colorful glow over the tense family standoff. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the cruiser. Their boots crunched heavily against the gravel as they approached the grand stone staircase. The moment the officers were within earshot, the unified antagonist front launched into their rehearsed performance. Tasha let out a loud theatrical gasp, clutching her designer handbag to her chest, as if she had just survived a harrowing ordeal. She pointed a trembling finger directly at Kendra, her voice wavering with perfectly calculated distress. She cried out to the officers, claiming that they were just a peaceful family, trying to move into their rightful home, only to be ambushed and harassed by a mentally unstable relative. Brenda immediately joined the chorus, her voice shrill and dripping with manufactured panic. The matriarch dramatically placed a hand over her heart, loudly declaring that Kendra was a bitter, jealous spinster who had completely lost her grip on reality. Brenda demanded that the officers immediately escort her dangerous, unhinged daughter off the premises before she could cause physical harm to Tasha or the children who were waiting back at their previous residence. Marcus stood tall, crossing his arms and nodding solemnly, playing the role of the protective patriarch dealing with a tragic family dispute. Brad stepped away from his wife and approached the officers with the casual, relaxed gait of a man who believed the law existed solely to serve him. He extended his hand in a polite, overly familiar greeting, putting on his best tech executive persona. He spoke in a calm, authoritative tone, completely contrasting the hysterical act put on by Tasha and Brenda. He introduced himself loudly, making sure to enunciate his full name and drop a subtle hint about his status as a startup founder. I explained to the officers that this was simply a minor, unfortunate family misunderstanding. He claimed that Kendra was a disgruntled sister who refused to accept the final wishes of their deceased relative. With a theatrical sigh of false sympathy, Brad reached into his breast pocket and retrieved the folded property deed. He smoothed out the creases with deliberate care and handed the fraudulent document directly to the lead officer. Brad smiled his signature predatory grin, confident that this single piece of paper would magically resolve the situation and grant him immediate dominion over the sweeping coastal property. He casually instructed the police to review the deed, verify his ownership, and kindly remove the trespasser from his front porch so his exhausted family could finally unpack their luggage. The lead officer, a stern-looking man with graying hair and an impassive expression, took the document from Brad without saying a word. The second officer stood a few paces back, his hand resting casually near his utility belt, his eyes scanning the faces of everyone present. The morning air grew thick with anticipation as the lead officer slowly unfolded the paper. He held it up, adjusting his position to catch the bright California sunlight. He read the text. He examined the margins. He scrutinized the modern word processor font, the layout, and the overall presentation of the document. Then his eyes dropped to the bottom of the page, settling on the signature and the notary stamp. The officer did not react. His face remained entirely stoic, completely devoid of the validating realization Brad was so eagerly waiting to see. The officer slowly lowered the paper. Instead of turning to Brad with an apology, the lead officer lifted his gaze and looked directly past the tech executive, past the hysterical mother, and past the golden child. The officer looked straight at Kendra, who was still standing perfectly still on the expansive porch. The chaotic noise of Tasha's fake crying and Brenda's loud complaints faded into the background. A silent, heavy exchange occurred between the forensic accountant and the officer. Kendra maintained direct eye contact. She did not speak. She did not point fingers. She simply offered a single distinct and deliberate nod. The officer returned the nod, a microscopic dip of his chin that went entirely unnoticed by the arrogant family standing on the cobblestones. The lead officer folded the document and handed it back to his partner without a word. Brad's confident smile began to waver just slightly as the expected script failed to materialize. He opened his mouth to reiterate his demands, perhaps to remind the officers of his high social standing or his tech empire, but the words died in his throat. The lead officer bypassed Kendra entirely. He did not ask her for identification. He did not ask her for her side of the story. He did not tell her to step off the property. The officer walked straight past the imported agave plants, straight past the discarded shreds of the trespassing notice, and marched directly up to Brad. The officer closed the distance with purposeful, uncompromising strides. He stopped mere inches from the startup founder, completely shattering Brad's personal space and his aura of unearned invincibility. Brad blinked, his mouth falling open in genuine shock as the reality of the situation finally breached his impenetrable ego. The officer reached behind his back, his hand wrapping around cold, heavy steel. The sharp, metallic clink of the handcuffs being unlatched cut through the salty morning air, a sound louder and more definitive than any siren. The officer grabbed Brad's wrist with swift, undeniable authority, twisting his arm behind his back in a single fluid motion. The metal ring snapped shut around Brad's wrists with a harsh final click. The officer spoke loudly, his voice echoing off the $4 million estate, delivering the words that would systematically dismantle the family's entire world. Braden Hayes, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud and forging real estate documents. The harsh metallic snap of the steel handcuffs, echoing across the pristine driveway, served as the definitive shattering of the family's carefully curated illusion. For one agonizing second, absolute silence descended upon the $4 million beachfront estate. The ocean waves crashing against the shoreline seemed to pause. The coastal breeze completely stopped. Brad stood frozen, his arms pinned awkwardly behind his back, his face draining of all color as the cold steel pressed into his wrists. The smug, predatory grin that had defined his entire existence vanished, replaced by a mask of raw, unfiltered terror. He looked down at the restraint, then up at the stoic police officer, unable to comprehend that his impenetrable shield of privilege had just spectacularly failed him. Then the momentary vacuum of silence collapsed instantly, replaced by an explosion of absolute chaos. Marcus moved first. The patriarch of the family, a man who had spent his entire adult life desperately clinging to the fringes of high society, completely lost his composure. He lunged forward, throwing his hands up in a frantic, misguided attempt to physically block the arresting officer. Marcus placed his body between the police and his wealthy white son-in-law, his face contorted in a mix of rage and absolute disbelief. He began screaming at the top of his lungs, his voice echoing violently off the sweeping architectural curves of the property. In a display of profound, staggering irony, Marcus loudly accused the officers of blatant racial profiling. He weaponized a struggle he had never truly allowed himself to experience, using it as a desperate shield to protect the white man who had just attempted to steal his daughter's inheritance. Marcus aggressively pointed his finger at the officer's uniform, demanding badge numbers and threatening immediate legal action. He yelled that they were making a catastrophic mistake. He bellowed that Brad was a legitimate, highly respected tech executive, a brilliant startup founder who brought immense prestige and status to their family name. Marcus screamed that men like Brad did not commit fraud, insisting that visionary leaders were simply misunderstood by the bureaucratic system. He desperately tried to reach for Brad's arm to pull him away, entirely blind to the reality that his beloved son-in-law was a common criminal caught in a blatant lie. The second officer immediately stepped in, placing a firm, uncompromising hand on Marcus's chest and forcing the frantic father back. The officer issued a stern, loud warning, advising Marcus that interfering with an active felony arrest would result in him joining his son-in-law in the back of the patrol cruiser. Marcus stumbled backward, his chest heaving, his eyes wild with panic, as his manufactured reality continued to crumble under the weight of the law. Witnessing her husband's failure to stop the arrest, Brenda unleashed a torrent of unhinged fury. She completely ignored the police officers and the man in handcuffs. She turned her entire body toward the front porch, her eyes locking onto Kendra with a gaze filled with pure, unadulterated hatred. Brenda marched forward, stopping just short of the imported agave plants. Her face flushed dark red with rage. She transformed her fear for Brad into a vicious, deeply personal attack against her youngest daughter. Brenda screamed that Kendra was a monster, a cold and calculating villain who had spent her entire life plotting this exact moment. The mother waved her arms wildly, pointing at the sprawling estate and declaring that Kendra was willing to destroy her own flesh and blood just to secure a piece of real estate she did not deserve. Brenda's voice cracked as she hurled the most venomous insults she could muster. She called Kendra a jealous, bitter spinster, a lonely woman whose heart had rotted from isolation. She shrieked that Kendra was incapable of finding a husband of her own, and because of this profound personal failure, she was now orchestrating a baseless legal attack to ruin Tasha's perfect marriage. Brenda constructed a wild, baseless narrative on the spot, accusing Kendra of bribing the police, of manipulating the legal system, and of acting entirely out of deep-seated spite to tear down a successful man out of pure jealousy. The matriarch demanded that Kendra call off the officers, immediately screaming that a good daughter would never humiliate her family in such a public and devastating manner. She demanded absolute obedience, relying on decades of emotional conditioning to force Kendra into immediate submission. Kendra did not shrink back. She did not raise her hands to defend herself against the verbal onslaught. She stood on the grand stone staircase, completely unfazed by the hysterical screaming of her parents. She allowed her mother to exhaust her lungs, watching the pathetic display of misplaced loyalty with the cold, detached observation of a scientist studying a volatile chemical reaction. When Brenda finally paused to take a ragged breath, Kendra initiated her counter-offensive. She slowly walked down the stone steps. Her movements were calm, deliberate, and entirely devoid of fear. The heels of her designer shoes clicked sharply against the cobblestone, a steady rhythmic sound that cut through the lingering chaos of the morning. She bypassed her screaming mother. She bypassed her frantic father. She walked straight up to the lead officer who was currently securing Brad's handcuffs. Kendra stopped mere feet from the struggling tech executive, looking him directly in the eyes. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply prepared to present the irrefutable data. Kendra spoke in a clear, resonant voice that carried perfectly across the driveway. She addressed the entire group, systematically dismantling their delusion with surgical precision. She stated that forging a property deed required an extreme attention to detail, a skill that Brad clearly lacked in every capacity. She calmly revealed the fatal flaw in the fraudulent document. Kendra explained that when she examined the paperwork on the porch, she immediately checked the notary stamp used to authenticate Great-Aunt Vivian's alleged signature. She stated that the stamp belonged to a specific licensed public notary operating out of Los Angeles County. Kendra paused, letting the silence stretch for one agonizing second before delivering the killing blow. She stated that the specific notary whose stamp appeared on Brad's fabricated deed had tragically passed away in a car accident, exactly 2 years before Aunt Vivian died. She explained that it was a physical and temporal impossibility for a dead man to notarize a real estate transfer for a woman in hospice care. The document was not just a fake. It was a remarkably sloppy, amateurish forgery that deeply insulted her professional intelligence. The irrefutable logic of Kendra's statement hung heavily in the air. The police officers nodded, their suspicions fully validated by the undeniable timeline. Brad's face dropped, all the remaining fight draining out of his body as the absolute certainty of his impending prison sentence washed over him. The undeniable truth of his federal crime was now exposed under the bright California sun, leaving him entirely defenseless. Tasha, however, refused to surrender to the truth. Watching her husband's inevitable downfall, the golden child panicked. She lunged forward, her linen dress wrinkling as she pointed a shaking finger at her sister. Her face was distorted with a volatile mix of terror and deep-seated rage. She screamed that Kendra was making it all up. Tasha yelled that Kendra was nothing more than a pathetic, jealous bean counter, a lowly clerk who spent her entire life staring at numbers and simply did not understand how high-level corporate business functioned. Tasha shrieked that Kendra was too stupid to grasp the complexities of real estate transfers and executive-level transactions. Kendra slowly turned to face her older sister. Her expression was perfectly composed. She looked at Tasha with a gaze cold enough to freeze the ocean. She took one step forward, closing the distance between them. "I am not a bean counter. I am a forensic accountant." The heavy oak front doors of the magnificent estate groaned as they swung open, breaking the tense standoff that had paralyzed everyone on the cobblestone driveway. The sharp sound drew the immediate attention of the police officers. The frantic parents, the sobbing golden child, and the handcuffed fraudster. From the shadowed interior of the foyer stepped a man who commanded absolute authority without uttering a single syllable. This was Elias. He was Great Aunt Vivian's longtime estate lawyer, a ruthless legal mind who had spent decades destroying corporate rivals and protecting the immense wealth of his formidable client. He stepped into the bright morning sunlight, his presence instantly shifting the gravitational pull of the entire scene. Elias wore a bespoke charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his tall, imposing frame. His silver hair was swept back with immaculate precision, and his dark eyes assessed the chaotic lawn with the cold, calculating detachment of a seasoned executioner observing a very predictable tragedy. In his right hand, Elias gripped a thick combination-locked titanium briefcase. It was the physical manifestation of undeniable legal truth. He walked down the grand stone staircase with slow, measured steps, his polished Oxford shoes echoing against the masonry. He did not rush. He let the anxiety of the trespassers build with every descending step. Brenda and Marcus fell completely silent, their previous hysterical screaming instantly evaporating. They recognized Elias. They remembered him from family gatherings years ago, always standing quietly in the corner taking mental notes on their behavior for Great Aunt Vivian. They knew perfectly well that Elias despised them, and his sudden appearance on the porch of the $4 million beachfront property signaled the absolute destruction of their remaining hopes. Elias reached the bottom of the stairs and bypassed the stunned family, entirely walking directly toward the two police officers. He offered a curt, respectful nod to the men in uniform. In a voice as smooth and unforgiving as polished steel, Elias introduced himself. He stated his full name and his credentials as the senior partner of the most prestigious law firm in the state. He officially identified himself as the sole executor of the late Vivian Hayes estate. The lead officer immediately relaxed his posture, recognizing the lawyer's elite reputation and understanding that the messy domestic dispute had just been elevated to a matter of concrete corporate law. Elias placed his heavy titanium briefcase onto the flat stone ledge of a nearby decorative planter. He adjusted his cuffs, perfectly composed, and looked directly at Brad, who was currently sweating profusely in police restraints. Elias did not bother to hide his absolute disgust for the tech startup founder. With a swift, practiced motion, Elias spun the numeric dials on his briefcase. The heavy metallic clicks of the brass locks snapping open echoed loudly in the salty coastal air, sounding remarkably like the final nails being driven into a coffin. He lifted the lid and reached inside, bypassing several thick legal folders to retrieve a specific, meticulously preserved document. He pulled out a massive stack of premium watermarked legal paper bound by heavy brass brads. The front page featured a thick embossed gold seal that practically radiated legitimacy. It was a stark, almost embarrassing contrast to the flimsy home-printed forgery that Brad had attempted to pass off just moments before. Elias turned to face the entire group, holding the heavy document with both hands. He announced clearly and loudly that he was holding the authentic, legally binding, and fully finalized irrevocable trust of Great Aunt Vivian. Brenda stepped forward, her hands trembling violently. She tried to muster her maternal authority, but her voice was weak and fractured. She desperately demanded to know what that document said, clinging to the pathetic hope that Aunt Vivian had left her some fraction of the estate. Elias looked at Brenda with eyes entirely devoid of pity. He informed her that Vivian was exceptionally lucid during her final months in hospice care. He stated that Vivian possessed a brilliant, uncompromising mind and had spent a considerable amount of time analyzing the deep-seated financial rot within her own family. Elias began to read directly from the executive summary of the trust. He projected his voice so every single word landed like a physical blow against the parents. He revealed that Aunt Vivian deliberately and explicitly bypassed Brenda and Marcus entirely in her final will. The legal text stated plainly that Vivian knew Brenda would instantly liquidate any inherited assets and blindly hand the cash over to Brad. Vivian had watched Brenda drain Kendra's college fund to pay for an ostentatious wedding. Vivian had documented every single time Marcus and Brenda prioritized the fake prestige of their white son-in-law over the fundamental well-being of their youngest daughter. The trust explicitly outlined that Brenda was legally barred from ever claiming a single cent, a single piece of furniture, or a single grain of sand on the entire beachfront property. Elias turned the heavy page, the crisp paper rustling loudly. He looked straight at Kendra, offering her a rare, genuine nod of profound respect. He announced to the police, to the fraudulent tech founder, and to the devastated family that Kendra was named as the 100% sole beneficiary of the irrevocable trust. The transfer of the deed had been fully executed, recorded with the county, and finalized legally 3 weeks prior. The $4 million estate belonged entirely to the forensic accountant, standing calmly on the driveway. There were no loopholes, there were no contingencies. The legal ironclad wall was completely impenetrable. The absolute finality of Elias's words struck the group with devastating force. The police officers immediately tightened their grip on Brad, thoroughly satisfied that they had arrested the correct person. Marcus slumped his shoulders, the illusion of his high society status shattering completely. Brenda let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper, covering her face with her hands, as the reality of her total disinheritance finally registered. But it was Brad who completely broke. The arrogant startup founder, realizing that his fake deed was entirely useless and his federal prison sentence was absolutely guaranteed, lost his mind. His carefully constructed mask of privileged superiority disintegrated into pure pathetic panic. The handcuffs rattled loudly as he struggled against the officers. His face turned a splotchy, terrifying shade of crimson. He twisted his neck wildly, locking his desperate eyes onto his wife. The unified front was dead. Brad lunged forward as far as the officers would allow, spitting venom as he screamed at Tasha. His voice was a raw, hysterical shriek that echoed over the crashing ocean waves. He blamed her for his total destruction. He screamed at the top of his lungs, his face contorted in absolute fury. "I told you we needed better forged signatures. You said she was just a dumb accountant." The echo of Brad's desperate, furious scream hung in the salty morning air, paralyzing everyone on the driveway. His words were a reckless, accidental confession that completely annihilated the meticulously crafted illusion of their perfect marriage. For a moment, Tasha simply stood there, frozen like a porcelain doll on the cobblestone. Her eyes were wide, darting from the heavy steel handcuffs on her husband's wrists to the stoic faces of the 2 police officers. The luxurious linen dress she wore suddenly seemed entirely out of place, no longer a symbol of wealth but the costume of an exposed fraud. The unified antagonist front, a toxic alliance built entirely on greed, entitlement, and the shared exploitation of Kendra, instantly shattered into jagged, irreparable pieces. Self-preservation took total control of the golden child. Tasha possessed a lifelong talent for evading responsibility, an instinct honed by decades of her parents, shielding her from every single consequence of her terrible decisions. Realizing that the man standing before her was no longer a prestigious tech founder, but a guaranteed federal inmate, she acted with brutal, immediate efficiency. She did not rush to his side. She did not offer words of comfort. Instead, she took 3 rapid, deliberate steps backward physically, severing herself from his proximity, as if his sudden criminality were a highly contagious disease. Her perfectly manicured facade crumpled, instantly replaced by a masterclass in theatrical victimhood. Tasha brought a trembling hand to her mouth, forcing a loud, ragged gasp that sounded remarkably authentic. She looked at the lead officer with wide, tear-filled eyes, violently shaking her head. She launched into a frantic, high-pitched denial, her voice vibrating with manufactured panic. She screamed that she had absolutely no idea what Brad was talking about. She swore on her life that she believed the property deed was completely genuine. She cried out that she was just a devoted wife who trusted her husband explicitly, a traditional woman who let her partner handle the complex legal and financial matters of their household. She pointed an accusatory finger directly at the man she had vowed to love, declaring loudly that he had manipulated her, lied to her, and dragged their innocent family into his twisted, illegal schemes without her knowledge or consent. Brad stared at his wife, his mouth agape in absolute disbelief. The sheer audacity of her instant betrayal hit him harder than the arrest itself. He was accustomed to Tasha defending him against the world, validating his delusions of grandeur and echoing his insults toward Kendra. To watch her effortlessly throw him under a fleet of metaphorical buses, to save her own skin, ignited a blinding, uncontrollable rage inside him. Brad was a narcissist who thrived on control, and the realization that his prized wife viewed him entirely as a disposable asset broke whatever fragile restraint he had left. He violently jerked his shoulders against the grip of the arresting officers, ignoring their stern commands to stop resisting. He spat his words out with venomous precision, eager to drag the golden child down into the exact same legal abyss he was now facing. He barked a harsh, ugly laugh, his voice cracking with desperation. He screamed that Tasha was a pathological liar who had orchestrated the entire forgery from the very beginning. He looked the lead officer directly in the eye, breathing heavily, and delivered the exact details of their criminal conspiracy. Brad loudly revealed that he did not even know where Great-Aunt Vivian kept her old legal supplies. He stated with absolute certainty that it was Tasha who had actively stolen the authentic watermarked stationery directly from Vivian's private desk. He painted a grotesque, unforgivable picture for the entire driveway to hear. He described how Tasha had visited the old woman's room at the hospice facility, pretending to be the grieving, devoted niece, gently holding the dying woman's hand. Brad sneered as he revealed that the moment Vivian drifted to sleep under the heavy medication, Tasha had ruthlessly rifled through the bedside drawers. He yelled that she was the one who swiped the blank pages bearing the official estate letterhead, smuggling them out in her expensive designer handbag, while wiping fake tears from her eyes. The revelation struck the driveway like a physical detonation. The sheer depravity of stealing from a dying relative on her deathbed silenced even the crashing ocean waves. Tasha let out a wild, feral shriek, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure rage. She lunged toward Brad, abandoning her delicate victim persona entirely. She screamed that he was a pathetic failed loser who could not even code a basic website, let alone run a successful tech empire. She yelled that he had begged her to find a way to secure the beachfront property because his ridiculous startup was bleeding cash and he was terrified of going bankrupt. The two of them tore each other apart right there on the pristine cobblestone lawn, completely oblivious to the audience witnessing their destruction. They hurled vicious, deeply personal insults, exposing years of hidden resentments, financial infidelity, and mutual disgust. The officers had to physically pull Brad backward to prevent Tasha from scratching his face. They barked harsh orders for order, threatening to arrest Tasha as an active accomplice if she did not step back immediately. Brenda and Marcus stood completely paralyzed on the sidelines. The parents who had mortgaged their souls and destroyed their relationship with their youngest daughter to worship this specific couple were now watching their gods bleed. Their brains could simply not process the cognitive dissonance of the golden child and the prestigious son-in-law violently exposing each other as common, ruthless criminals. Marcus leaned heavily against the silver luxury SUV, his chest heaving as he stared at the shattered pieces of his fabricated high society legacy. Brenda clutched her chest, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound, utterly destroyed by the undeniable proof of Tasha's monstrous behavior at the hospice facility. Kendra and Elias remained perfectly still on the front porch, watching the implosion with cold, quiet satisfaction. The forensic accountant did not need to lift a finger or utter a single word to dismantle their lives. She had simply provided the environment where their own toxic greed could finally consume them. Realizing that the police officers were taking mental notes of every single confession Brad was shouting and understanding that her pristine reputation was now completely annihilated, Tasha panicked. She desperately needed a scapegoat, a new target to deflect the devastating consequences of her actions. She could not attack Elias, the imposing lawyer holding the ironclad trust. She could not fight the police. Therefore, she pivoted back to the only person she had ever been allowed to abuse without consequence. Tasha spun around her linen dress, whipping in the coastal breeze. She turned her back on her arrested husband and sprinted toward her devastated parents. She collapsed to her knees right in front of Brenda, burying her face in her mother's hands. She unleashed a torrent of loud, dramatic sobs, violently shaking her shoulders to simulate a complete mental breakdown. She played the ultimate desperate victim card, shifting the blame for the entire morning's catastrophe onto the woman standing quietly on the porch. Tasha lifted her tear-stained face, pointing a shaking finger directly at Kendra, and delivered her final pathetic accusation. Kendra made Brad's startup go bankrupt, she reported him. Now we're homeless, Mom. Tasha's desperate accusation pierced the morning air, providing the exact lifeline her devastated parents needed. Brenda and Marcus, utterly incapable of processing the undeniable reality of their golden child's criminal behavior and their son-in-law's impending prison sentence, seized upon the new narrative with feral desperation. They could not accept that they had worshipped a fraud. They could not fathom that their lifelong investment in Tasha's fake prestige was a total loss. Therefore, they instantly reverted to their default setting. They turned their combined rage entirely onto Kendra. The parents pivoted away from the handcuffed tech executive and the weeping accomplice, marching toward the front steps of the estate like an advancing army. Brenda's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure self-righteous fury. She screamed that Kendra was a venomous snake, a vindictive saboteur who had spent her entire adult life plotting the downfall of her betters. Brenda yelled that Kendra could not stand to see her sister happy, claiming that Kendra had abused her accounting credentials to file false reports and destroy a legitimate booming business. Marcus stepped up right beside his wife, his chest heaving with misplaced patriarchal authority. He aggressively pointed his finger at his youngest daughter, his voice booming across the cobblestone driveway. He demanded to know how Kendra could sleep at night after ruining Brad's brilliant entrepreneurial vision. Marcus bellowed that Brad was on the verge of revolutionizing the tech industry, that his startup was a guaranteed unicorn destined for public trading. He accused Kendra of triggering a baseless federal investigation out of pure, unadulterated spite. He shouted that she had weaponized her job to freeze Brad's assets, strangle his cash flow, and artificially force the company into bankruptcy, just to humiliate the family. Marcus declared that Kendra was dead to him, a traitor to her own blood, who had intentionally rendered her sister homeless, and her brother-in-law a victim of a corrupt legal system. Kendra stood perfectly still on the expansive porch, absorbing the barrage of irrational hatred without flinching. She did not raise her voice to defend herself. She did not shed a single tear over her father's brutal declaration of disownment. She had mourned the death of her parents' love a long time ago. Today she was simply reviewing the final autopsy report. Kendra calmly reached into the sleek leather tote bag, resting on the stone planter next to Elias. She retrieved her silver tablet, the glass screen cool and heavy in her hands. She tapped the screen, her fingers flying across the digital keyboard with practiced rhythmic precision. She bypassed the strict security protocols, opened a highly encrypted file directory, and loaded a series of meticulously compiled banking statements. Kendra took 2 steps forward, closing the distance between the porch and the screaming parents. Her sheer professional presence, the undeniable aura of a woman who dealt exclusively in hard, unforgiving facts, forced Brenda and Marcus to pause their hysterical rant. Kendra held the tablet flat in her left hand. She looked directly at her father, her voice echoing with the cold, absolute authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. She stated clearly that she did not destroy a tech startup because there was absolutely no tech startup to destroy. She informed them that Brad's grand corporate vision was nothing more than an elaborate financial mirage, a fragile house of cards constructed entirely on lies, forged documents, and stolen capital. Kendra tapped the screen again, turning the bright display slightly so the harsh California sunlight would not create a glare. She began to read the forensic evidence aloud, her tone completely devoid of emotion, allowing the brutal financial data to speak for itself. She declared that Brad Hayes did not own an innovative software company. He owned a hollow shell company, a rudimentary limited liability corporation registered in a lenient tax state with 0 actual employees, 0 proprietary code, and 0 legitimate revenue streams. She explained that the entire operation was a textbook Ponzi scheme designed exclusively to funnel investor capital directly into his personal bank accounts to fund a lifestyle he could not actually afford. Kendra scrolled down the page, her eyes scanning the itemized transaction history she had painstakingly reconstructed over the past 6 months. She raised her voice so Tasha, who was still kneeling on the driveway, could hear every single word. Kendra read the corporate expenses aloud. She listed hundreds of thousands of dollars wired directly into high roller accounts at premium Las Vegas casinos. She detailed the extravagant weekend trips, the private jet charters masked as business travel, and the astronomical losses at the baccarat tables. She explained how Brad had systematically drained the company's operating budget to cover his gambling debts, labeling the casino transfers on the official ledger as research and development costs. The reality of the financial ruin began to settle over the driveway. Brad, still restrained by the police officers, closed his eyes and lowered his head, knowing his absolute exposure was now complete. But Kendra was not finished. She scrolled to the final, most devastating section of the financial audit. She told Tasha to listen very closely because the next set of expenses directly concerned the sanctity of her perfect high society marriage. Kendra highlighted a recurring, automated monthly wire transfer categorized in the ledger as a corporate housing stipend for a lead software developer. Kendra looked directly at Tasha and stated that the company did not employ a lead software developer. She revealed that the monthly wire transfer was actually a premium lease payment for a luxury penthouse condo located in the most expensive downtown district of the city. She read the exact dollar amount of the rent, a staggering figure that exceeded Tasha's annual shopping budget. Then Kendra delivered the fatal blow to her sister's ego. She announced the name on the lease agreement. It was a 22-year-old fitness influencer. Kendra ruthlessly detailed the supplementary transactions attached to the condo address. She read aloud the receipts for designer handbags, diamond jewelry, and expensive lingerie, all purchased with the stolen startup funds and all delivered directly to the mistress. She stated that Brad had been fully supporting another woman for the past 3 years, draining the company completely dry to maintain his secret double life, while Tasha paraded around the country club bragging about her visionary husband. Tasha looked at the digital bank statements displayed on the tablet in absolute, unadulterated horror. The blood drained completely from her face. The meticulously constructed illusion of her superior perfect life disintegrated instantly, leaving behind nothing but the humiliating reality that she had been used, discarded, and profoundly betrayed by the man she had stolen for. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a hollow, breathless gasp escaped. She was thoroughly destroyed. However, Marcus refused to surrender to the truth. The patriarch of the family, driven entirely by his pathological obsession with social status and his desperate need to be right, doubled down in the face of absolute financial ruin. He completely ignored the revelation of the gambling addiction. He brushed past the undeniable proof of the young mistress. Marcus took a defiant step forward, his face red and sweating, and delivered a statement so shocking it made Elias raise an eyebrow. Marcus yelled out loud, asking, "So what if Brad had made a few personal mistakes along the way?" The father screamed that business was a ruthless environment and visionary men were allowed to have their flaws. He violently pointed his finger at the beachfront estate, his voice cracking with sheer unfiltered greed. He confessed their darkest, most desperate secret right there on the lawn. Marcus bellowed that they had personally invested $1.5 million into that shell company. He screamed that he needed this house to recoup their losses. The echo of Marcus's booming confession hung suspended in the salty coastal air, temporarily freezing the chaotic scene on the cobblestone driveway. $1.5 million. The staggering figure struck Kendra with the physical force of a heavy blow, leaving her momentarily stunned in the center of her expansive front porch. Her mind, perfectly trained to instantly process complex financial data, immediately began to run the grim calculations. She knew her parents' financial portfolio intimately. She knew they did not possess that kind of liquid capital. Their entire net worth had been tied up in the comfortable, paid-off suburban home they had purchased 3 decades ago, and the modest retirement accounts they had steadily built over their working years. To produce $1.5 million in cash, they would have had to systematically dismantle every single pillar of their financial security. The horrifying realization washed over Kendra like a freezing tidal wave. Her parents had secretly taken out a massive high-interest reverse mortgage on their fully owned property. They had willingly drained their retirement accounts, liquidated their mutual funds, and completely wiped out their life savings. They had bet every single cent of their future on a man who was currently wearing federal handcuffs, all to fund a hollow shell company that did not actually exist. The absolute sheer scale of their financial ruin was almost impossible to comprehend. Kendra stared at her father, watching the desperate sweat bead on his forehead, and realized the profound depth of their delusion. They had not just made a poor investment. They had actively participated in their own financial slaughter. They had eagerly handed over their entire life's work to Brad because they were fundamentally intoxicated by the illusion of his prestige. They had traded their hard-earned, quiet stability for the fleeting thrill of being able to brag at their country club dinners about their brilliant white son-in-law and his revolutionary tech empire. They had willingly purchased a front-row ticket to a lifestyle they could not afford, desperate to maintain the facade of a wealthy, highly successful family. And now the bill was finally due. The reality that Marcus was willing to completely overlook Brad's gambling addiction, the stolen investor funds, and the 22-year-old mistress entirely, because he was terrified of his own impending bankruptcy, highlighted a level of moral bankruptcy that sickened Kendra to her core. Her father did not care that Tasha had been humiliated. He did not care that Brad had committed federal wire fraud. He only cared that his money was gone, and he was desperately looking for a magical lifeline to save him from the consequences of his own catastrophic greed. Before Kendra could fully articulate the sheer stupidity of their financial suicide, Brenda launched her own desperate offensive. The matriarch finally grasping the terrifying reality that she was practically destitute, completely abandoned any remaining pretense of maternal affection. She marched up to the bottom of the grand stone staircase, her face contorted with a terrifying, unyielding entitlement. Brenda aggressively pointed her finger at the sweeping architectural curves of the $4 million beachfront property, acting as if the estate was merely a bargaining chip waiting to be cashed in. She completely ignored the police officers. She ignored the fact that her son-in-law was currently being loaded into the back of a black and white patrol cruiser. Brenda locked her wild, furious eyes onto Kendra and delivered a demand so profoundly audacious that it bordered on clinical insanity. She loudly ordered her youngest daughter to immediately march back into the house, contact a real estate broker, and sign the entire property over to them right this very second. She screamed that they needed to list the estate on the market by noon, insisting that the profits from the rapid sale would be more than enough to cover the $1.5 million debt and secure their retirement once again. Brenda did not stop there. She leaned heavily into the toxic, manipulative rhetoric that had governed their household for decades. She screamed the phrase "family sacrifices for family" at the top of her lungs, weaponizing the concept of loyalty to force Kendra into instant submission. Brenda aggressively rewrote history right on the driveway, claiming that they had sacrificed everything to raise Kendra, conveniently omitting the fact that they had stolen her college fund to pay for Tasha's extravagant wedding. The mother demanded absolute compliance, insisting that it was Kendra's fundamental duty to forfeit her entire inheritance to save her parents from homelessness. Brenda shrieked that a good daughter would never allow her family to suffer financial ruin, completely ignoring the fact that they had eagerly brought this ruin upon themselves. She ordered Kendra to stop being selfish, to stop holding grudges over the past, and to do the right thing for the sake of the family legacy. The sheer volume of Brenda's screaming forced the crashing ocean waves into the background, filling the pristine coastal air with the toxic sound of unadulterated desperation. Kendra stood on the porch, her silver tablet still gripped firmly in her left hand. She looked down at her mother's flushed, furious face, then shifted her gaze to her father's desperate, demanding posture. Finally, she looked past him, locking eyes with Brad, who was currently slumped defeatedly in the back seat of the police cruiser, the heavy door slamming shut behind him. The absolute absurdity of the situation finally reached its breaking point. A low, bitter laugh bubbled up from deep within Kendra's chest. The sound was sharp, cold, and entirely devoid of any humor. It was the sound of a woman who had finally watched the absolute worst aspects of her family completely cannibalize themselves. The laughter echoed across the cobblestone, cutting through Brenda's hysterical demands and silencing the frantic parents. Kendra stopped laughing and took one slow, deliberate step forward, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unforgiving granite. She looked her mother dead in the eye, her voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. "You want me to sacrifice my rightful inheritance to pay off the massive gambling debt of the man currently sitting in the back of a squad car for federal fraud?" Kendra delivered the question with a piercing clarity that left no room for argument or negotiation. She let the sheer stupidity of the request hang in the air, forcing her parents to truly hear the pathetic nature of their demands. Before Brenda could even attempt to formulate a response, the heavy, imposing figure of Elias stepped forward from the shadows of the doorway. The ruthless estate lawyer moved with a quiet, lethal grace, his polished Oxford shoes clicking against the masonry. He stopped right beside Kendra, his presence radiating an impenetrable wall of legal authority. He looked down at the desperate parents with absolute disgust, recognizing the exact brand of greed that Great-Aunt Vivian had warned him about. Elias smoothly reached his hand into his tailored suit jacket, his fingers brushing against a carefully preserved envelope. His voice was smooth, dark, and utterly devoid of mercy. "Miss Kendra, I believe it is time for the letter." Elias stood tall against the coastal wind, his tailored suit completely undisturbed by the morning chaos. From the inner pocket of his jacket, he produced a heavy yellowed envelope. The parchment was thick, showing the unmistakable signs of aging, yet preserved with immaculate care. A deep red wax seal held the flap shut, bearing the distinct aristocratic crest of Great-Aunt Vivian. The sheer visual weight of the object commanded immediate silence. The crashing of the ocean waves seemed to fade into a distant hum. Even the two police officers who were just about to slide into the front seats of their patrol cruiser paused. The lead officer left his door cracked open, resting his arm on the frame, his eyes fixed on the imposing lawyer. The chaotic energy of the driveway evaporated, replaced by a suffocating dense anticipation. Brenda and Marcus stood frozen at the base of the grand stone staircase. The manic desperation that had fueled their previous screaming match was instantly replaced by a cold, creeping dread. They recognized the stationery. They recognized the wax seal. This was the voice of the matriarch they had spent their entire lives trying to impress, the woman whose immense wealth they felt inherently entitled to claim. Elias did not rush. Instead, he took a deep, calculated breath, standing with the perfect posture of a man who held the absolute power to destroy lives. He held the yellowed envelope up, allowing the bright California sunlight to illuminate the crisp handwriting on the front. It was addressed to no one in particular, serving as a final definitive decree to the entire family. With a swift, deliberate motion, Elias broke the red wax seal. The sharp crack echoed across the cobblestone like a tiny, localized gunshot. He slid a single heavily folded sheet of premium paper from the envelope, shaking it open with a crisp flick of his wrist. He cleared his throat, the sound deep and resonant, preparing to deliver the words of a dead woman who had seen through every single one of their pathetic lies. Elias began to read. His voice carried the full, devastating weight of Great-Aunt Vivian's unyielding judgment. He did not read with dramatic flair. He read with cold, clinical precision, ensuring that every single syllable struck its intended target with maximum impact. The letter opened without a greeting, diving straight into a brutal, unvarnished assessment of the two parents standing on the lawn. Vivian wrote that she had spent decades watching Brenda and Marcus operate. She described them as hollow, superficial creatures, driven entirely by a pathetic desperation for social validation. The letter eviscerated their entire parenting strategy. Vivian detailed how she had silently observed them neglect Kendra for her entire life. She wrote about the countless holidays where Kendra was shoved into the background, ignored and marginalized, while every ounce of parental affection, financial support, and public praise was violently showered upon Tasha. Vivian explicitly named the systemic emotional abuse, stating that Brenda and Marcus had actively tried to crush Kendra's spirit simply because she refused to participate in their shallow status-obsessed delusions. The dead woman's words cut through the salty air, systematically dismantling the false narrative of the loving self-sacrificing family. Vivian wrote that she watched in absolute disgust as the parents worshipped Brad, a man she immediately recognized as a parasitic grifter the moment he stepped foot into her home. She mocked their sheer stupidity, laughing from beyond the grave at how easily they were blinded by a fleece vest, a fake tech vocabulary, and a false aura of white upper-class prestige. The letter continued, shifting from a brutal character assassination to a methodical explanation of her final legal maneuvers. Vivian stated that she knew exactly what would happen the moment her heart stopped beating. She predicted with terrifying accuracy that Brenda would immediately descend upon her estate like a starving vulture, eager to liquidate every single asset to feed Brad's insatiable, fraudulent ego. Therefore, Vivian wrote, she had spent the last 2 years of her life working closely with Elias to construct an impenetrable legal fortress. She described the irrevocable trust as a bulletproof vault, explicitly designed to lock Brenda, Marcus, and Tasha out of her wealth for the rest of eternity. Vivian stated that she deliberately bypassed the parents because they had proven themselves to be catastrophically irresponsible and morally bankrupt. She left the $4 million beachfront property to Kendra, not just because Kendra was the only family member who possessed actual intelligence and integrity, but because Kendra was the only one who actually deserved a sanctuary away from their toxic parasitic grasp. Brenda, unable to handle the brutal honesty, let out a soft, shattered whimper. Her knees buckled slightly, the undeniable truth of Vivian's final judgment, crushing whatever fragile ego she had left. Marcus stared blankly at the ground, his face pale, completely stripped of his arrogant patriarchal authority. Tasha remained curled up on the cold pavement, sobbing heavily into her hands, as her entire identity was verbally incinerated by a woman she truly thought she could easily manipulate. But Elias was not finished with them just yet. The seasoned lawyer deliberately paused, letting the devastating silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment across the grand estate. He slowly looked up from the heavy paper, his dark eyes locking directly onto Marcus. He lowered his voice, dropping the volume down just enough to force the ruined family to desperately lean in and listen to their ultimate doom. Elias looked back down at the letter and read the final, concluding paragraph with absolute clarity. Vivian wrote that protecting Kendra and securing the estate was merely the first phase of her brilliant plan. She stated that she could not simply pass away and leave the scales so terribly unbalanced. The final sentence hung in the air like a blade. But I didn't just leave Kendra the house. I left her the trap you walked right into. The word trap hung over the driveway, a sharp, invisible blade poised directly over their heads. Brenda snapped. The terror of the unknown shattered her momentary stupor, triggering a violent surge of pure denial. She lunged forward, her sensible shoes scraping harshly against the cobblestone. She pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the distinguished estate lawyer, her voice tearing through the salty coastal air in a frantic, high-pitched shriek. She screamed that the letter was a complete fabrication, a malicious forgery concocted by Elias and Kendra to torment a grieving family. Brenda demanded to see the paper, insisting that Great-Aunt Vivian would never use such cruel language or lay traps for her own flesh and blood. She yelled that it was physically impossible for a dying woman confined to a hospice bed to orchestrate any kind of elaborate scheme. The matriarch practically vibrated with aggressive panic, demanding to know exactly what imaginary trap Elias was referring to, desperate to find a loophole in the tightening legal noose. Elias did not flinch. He did not step back. He merely lowered the heavy yellowed paper a fraction of an inch and pinned Brenda with a stare so intensely cold it instantly silenced her hysterical outburst. He calmly informed her that challenging the authenticity of a document sealed with the deceased's personal crest and witnessed by a senior law partner would only accelerate their financial ruin. Without waiting for a response, Elias lifted the letter back into the bright California sunlight. He adjusted his posture, his immaculate suit settling perfectly, and proceeded to read the next meticulously crafted paragraph. Vivian's posthumous voice returned to the driveway, shifting from personal condemnation to a breathtaking display of strategic financial warfare. The letter detailed a timeline that made Marcus physically recoil. Vivian wrote about the exact moment 18 months prior when Brad's ridiculous shell company began to violently hemorrhage cash. She described how Brad, desperate to maintain his lavish lifestyle and terrified of exposing his massive gambling losses, began frantically soliciting high-risk loans to keep his pathetic Ponzi scheme afloat. Elias's voice boomed across the $4 million property, echoing off the sweeping architectural curves. Vivian's letter exposed how Brad had exhausted traditional banking options, his credit ruined, and his corporate assets utterly non-existent. It painted a pathetic picture of the arrogant tech founder begging for capital in shady boardrooms, completely unaware that his every move was being tracked by Vivian's elite team of private financial investigators. The dead woman wrote that she watched with absolute fascination as Marcus and Brenda, blinded by their desperate need for social prestige, foolishly mortgaged their fully paid-off suburban home to inject a massive wave of capital into Brad's sinking ship. Vivian noted the exact date the parents signed away their life savings, mocking their catastrophic lack of basic financial literacy. But then the letter revealed the masterstroke. Vivian explained that a massive influx of cash from the parents was still not enough to plug the gaping hole left by Brad's Las Vegas baccarat habits and his penthouse lease for the 22-year-old mistress. The shell company was still drowning. Elias paused, letting the sheer weight of the impending revelation settle over the ruined family. He read the next sentence with a terrifyingly slow, deliberate cadence. Vivian wrote that right when Brad was on the verge of total bankruptcy, a miraculous financial savior appeared. An anonymous private equity firm operating under a discreet corporate umbrella approached the desperate startup founder. This mysterious entity offered to restructure his failing enterprise. They aggressively bought up every single piece of corporate debt Brad had accumulated, but they did not stop there. The letter revealed that this same anonymous firm approached the predatory lender who held Marcus and Brenda's high-interest reverse mortgage. With ruthless efficiency, the private equity firm purchased the parents' mortgage debt as well, consolidating the entire family's financial obligations under one single unified corporate umbrella. Vivian wrote that Brad had proudly bragged at a family dinner about securing a brilliant angel investor, completely oblivious to the fact that he had voluntarily locked his own neck into a carefully constructed financial guillotine. The absolute silence on the driveway was deafening. Even the two police officers stood completely frozen, utterly captivated by the sheer magnitude of the dead woman's revenge. Brad, slumped in the back of the patrol cruiser, pressed his face against the reinforced glass, his eyes wide with a dawning, suffocating horror. He remembered the angel investor. He remembered signing the draconian loan agreements, arrogant enough to believe he could outsmart the invisible corporate entity. Marcus began to hyperventilate, his hands clutching his chest as the terrifying reality of their consolidated debt suddenly materialized in his mind. He realized that they did not just owe money to a faceless bank. They had handed the literal deed to their home to an aggressive private equity firm. Brenda's voice was barely a whisper now, her aggressive entitlement completely evaporated. She asked, her voice cracking, who the investor was. She begged Elias to tell her the name of the firm holding the mortgage to their home. Elias looked down at her with a microscopic, utterly merciless smile. He looked back at the heavy parchment and read the final lines. Vivian revealed that the anonymous angel investor, the discreet private equity firm that legally owned every single cent of Brad's corporate debt and the entirety of the parents' residential mortgage, was a limited liability company, completely funded, owned, and operated by Vivian herself. She had bought their debt to own their future. Elias let the yellowed paper drop to his side. He turned his head slowly, looking at the forensic accountant, standing quietly on the grand stone staircase. He delivered the final crushing blow, without reading from the page, his voice echoing with absolute legal finality. And in accordance with the irrevocable trust, Great Aunt Vivian left that limited liability company and all its assets entirely to Kendra. The sheer magnitude of the revelation struck the driveway with the devastating force of a runaway freight train. For several long, agonizing seconds, the only sound that existed in the world was the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean against the shoreline. The words spoken by the estate lawyer hung in the coastal air, a permanent, inescapable truth that completely reorganized the power dynamic of the entire family. Marcus, a man who had spent his entire life projecting an aura of untouchable patriarchal authority, physically crumbled. His knees buckled under the crushing weight of his absolute financial destruction. He reached out blindly, his hand gripping the cold metal door handle of the haphazardly parked silver luxury SUV, just to keep himself from collapsing onto the cobblestones. His breathing became ragged and shallow. The terrifying realization that he had willingly handed the literal deed to his suburban home over to the daughter he had spent 3 decades aggressively marginalizing paralyzed his entire nervous system. He was no longer the proud investor of a booming tech empire. He was a desperate debtor entirely at the mercy of the child he had ruthlessly betrayed. Brenda stood perfectly still, rendered completely mute for the first time in her existence. The aggressive, entitled matriarch who had marched up the driveway demanding keys to the master suite was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified shell. Her eyes darted wildly between the distinguished lawyer and the forensic accountant, her brain desperately trying to process a reality that fundamentally broke her worldview. She had spent her life believing that Kendra was weak, submissive, and easily manipulated. Now she stared at a woman who held total, absolute dominion over her entire future. Brenda opened her mouth to speak, perhaps to offer a pathetic apology or to beg for maternal mercy, but her vocal cords completely failed her. The sheer scale of Great Aunt Vivian's posthumous revenge had meticulously stripped away every single ounce of leverage Brenda possessed. In the back of the black and white patrol cruiser, the situation was even more dire. Brad pressed his forehead against the reinforced glass, his face draining of all remaining color until he looked practically deceased. The arrogant smirk, the condescending tech vocabulary, and the impenetrable shield of white privilege had all been violently ripped away. He was fully aware of the draconian terms he had signed when he accepted the anonymous capital. He knew the interest rates were astronomical, and he knew the collateral clauses were completely unforgiving. The terrifying realization that his angel investor was actually the brilliant forensic accountant's sister-in-law he had just attempted to render homeless sent a violent shudder down his spine. He closed his eyes, the heavy steel handcuffs biting into his wrists, understanding that his federal prison sentence was only the beginning of his absolute ruin. Tasha remained entirely paralyzed on the cold pavement. The golden child, completely stripped of her wealthy husband, her stolen prestige, and her parental safety net, finally understood the true cost of her lifelong cruelty. She looked up at her younger sister, her tear-streaked face a portrait of unadulterated horror. Kendra did not offer them a single moment of reprieve. She did not allow the shock to settle or the silence to soften the blow. She took a slow, deliberate step down from the grand stone staircase, her movements projecting absolute, undeniable authority. She was no longer just the rightful owner of the $4 million beachfront property. She was the absolute architect of their total accountability. She closed the distance between herself and her devastated parents, stopping mere feet away from where Marcus leaned heavily against the SUV. Her expression was perfectly composed, completely devoid of the petty gloating they would have undoubtedly displayed if the roles were reversed. She operated with the cold, clinical precision of a professional balancing an incredibly complex ledger. She looked her father dead in the eye, forcing him to meet her gaze. She did not yell, she did not raise her voice. She spoke with a quiet, resonant clarity that carried the full, terrifying weight of the law. She stated that for her entire life, They had treated her like a minor inconvenience, a secondary citizen in their desperate pursuit of high society validation. She reminded them of every single time they had demanded she sacrifice her own stability to fund their shallow illusions. Then Kendra delivered the reality of their new existence. She stated clearly that she was not just the owner of the beach house they had aggressively tried to steal. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a register of pure, unforgiving steel. She announced that she was their sole creditor. She systematically listed her assets, watching the hope drain completely from their eyes. She informed them that she owned every single cent of Brad's toxic corporate debt. She stated that she owned the high-interest reverse mortgage they had foolishly taken out on their home. She controlled their equity. She controlled their credit. She controlled their entire financial reality. Kendra explained that the anonymous limited liability company they had so eagerly sold their souls to was fully operational and entirely under her direct command. She reminded them that business was an incredibly ruthless environment, throwing her father's previous words directly back into his face. She watched Marcus flinch, the profound irony of his own toxic philosophy ultimately sealing his fate. With slow, deliberate precision, Kendra raised her left arm. She pulled back the cuff of her simple silk blouse, exposing a sleek, elegant silver watch on her wrist. She looked down at the precise dial, watching the sweeping second hand sweep across the minimalist face. She allowed the silence to stretch for 3 long, agonizing heartbeats, letting the sheer terror of the moment fully saturate their minds. She looked back up, her eyes locking onto her ruined parents. And since Brad's company defaulted on the payments 3 months ago, the grace period is officially over. The phrase hung in the air, a definitive death sentence for the family's financial future. The grace period was over, and with it the last remaining shred of Marcus's manufactured dignity completely evaporated. The sheer terror that had briefly paralyzed the patriarch rapidly mutated into a desperate, volatile rage. Marcus could not physically or mentally process the reality of his complete subjugation. He had spent his entire adult life ruling his household with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and respect from his children, while actively enabling the golden child. To be cornered, outsmarted, and financially enslaved by the daughter he had consistently deemed unworthy was a psychological blow he simply refused to accept. His survival instinct kicked in, reverting him instantly to the only tactic he knew. He tried to reclaim his stolen throne through sheer force. Marcus let go of the silver luxury SUV door handle. He squared his broad shoulders, puffing out his chest to maximize his physical presence, and took a heavy, aggressive step toward Kendra. His face flushed a dark, dangerous crimson, the veins bulging visibly on his neck. He raised his hands, completely ignoring the devastating legal reality that had just been laid out before him, and attempted to weaponize his patriarchal authority one final time. He barked an order, his voice booming across the pristine driveway, attempting to sound like a king, commanding a disobedient servant rather than a desperate debtor begging for his very life. He demanded that Kendra immediately contact her bank and formally forgive the entire debt right this very second. He commanded her to drop the ridiculous charade, insisting that this was a private family matter, and he would not allow a child of his to humiliate him on a public driveway. I took another step forward, violating Kendra's personal space, in a blatant display of physical intimidation. He loomed over her, his eyes wild and completely unhinged. He raised a heavy, calloused hand, pointing a thick finger directly at her face. Marcus roared that he was her father, the head of the household, and she was fundamentally obligated to obey his direct commands without question. He ordered her to sign the paperwork, cancel the loan, and hand over the keys to the estate immediately so they could fix Brad's mistakes like a real family. He practically spit the words, trying to use the sheer volume of his voice to bludgeon Kendra into submission, desperately clinging to the illusion that he still held any power whatsoever. Kendra did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She stood perfectly grounded on the cobblestones. Her chin raised, her eyes locked onto her father's furious face with the unyielding stillness of a stone statue. She did not need to raise her voice or match his aggression, because she held all the leverage. Before Marcus could escalate his physical intimidation any further, the law intervened. The two police officers, having witnessed the entire exchange and recognizing the immediate threat of domestic violence, moved with swift, practiced efficiency. The lead officer stepped directly between Kendra and her towering father. He placed a firm, uncompromising hand squarely in the center of Marcus's chest and shoved him backward with significant physical force. The officer issued a harsh, booming warning, ordering the patriarch to step back immediately and keep his hands to himself. He reminded Marcus in no uncertain terms that he was currently standing inches away from being arrested for assaulting the legal owner of the property. Marcus stumbled backward, his heavy shoes scraping against the gravel. He breathed heavily, glaring at the officer, but the threat of joining his son-in-law in the back of the patrol cruiser finally pierced his blind rage. He stopped moving, his chest heaving as the reality of his total powerlessness settled heavily over his shoulders. Kendra looked past the officer, staring directly at her defeated father. She remained entirely unaffected by his pathetic display of dominance. She calmly informed him that his patriarchal authority held absolutely zero currency in her world. She stated that he had forfeited the right to demand blind family loyalty the exact moment he drained her college fund to finance Tasha's vanity. Kendra leaned into her professional persona, her voice radiating the cold, calculating detachment of a seasoned forensic accountant dealing with a hostile corporate takeover. She reminded Marcus of his own words, throwing his toxic philosophy directly back into his face. She told him that business was strictly business, and she was simply executing the strict terms of a legally binding contract that he had willingly signed. She opened her silver tablet once more, the bright screen illuminating her calm, determined face. She tapped a few keys, bringing up the official ledger for the limited liability company. She read the outstanding balance aloud, ensuring the number echoed clearly across the entire estate. $1.5 million. She informed Marcus and Brenda that because the shell company had defaulted on 3 consecutive payments, the entire remaining balance of the consolidated loan was now due immediately. There would be no payment plans, there would be no negotiations, there would be no family discounts. Kendra looked up from the tablet, her eyes locking onto her father with absolute terrifying finality. She delivered the ultimate ultimatum, her words sharp and uncompromising. She stated that they had exactly until 5:00 p.m. today to secure the funds. She told them they needed to call every single relative, drain every single hidden account, and beg every single bank they could find. She set the deadline with the precision of a ticking time bomb, leaving absolutely no room for interpretation. The air on the driveway grew incredibly thin as the weight of the impossible task crushed the parents. Kendra stood tall, completely victorious, and delivered the final blow. If the funds aren't in my trust account by 5:00 p.m., I am initiating full foreclosure on your house, Dad. You'll be evicted by the end of the month. The devastating finality of the eviction threat shattered the remaining fragments of reality for the woman still crumpled on the pristine cobblestones. Tasha had spent her entire existence safely cocooned inside a protective bubble of parental favoritism and unearned privilege. She had never faced a single consequence, never paid a bill she could not afford, and never experienced the cold, unforgiving sting of genuine accountability. Now, the absolute destruction of her carefully curated world crashed down upon her all at once. Her husband, the supposed visionary tech executive, was locked in the back of a police cruiser waiting for federal prison. Her parents, the endless source of her financial bailouts, were completely destitute and facing imminent homelessness. Her own bank accounts were tied to a fraudulent shell company that was violently bleeding cash. She was suddenly and entirely broke. Tasha slowly pushed herself off the cold pavement. The luxurious linen dress she had worn to claim her new coastal kingdom was stained and deeply wrinkled, mirroring the absolute ruin of her personal brand. She did not look at the $4 million beachfront estate anymore. She did not look at the stoic forensic accountant standing victorious on the grand stone staircase. Instead, the golden child turned her frantic, tear-streaked face entirely toward her devastated parents. The lifelong bond of mutual exploitation that had united them against Kendra instantly dissolved, replaced by a vicious feral desperation for personal self-preservation. Tasha staggered toward Marcus and Brenda, her breathing erratic and shallow. She pointed a shaking finger at her father, who was still leaning heavily against the silver luxury SUV, completely paralyzed by his impending bankruptcy. Tasha demanded that they fix this catastrophe immediately. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with a potent mixture of terror and unadulterated entitlement. She commanded her father to make a phone call to pull a hidden string, to access a secret account, utterly refusing to accept that the endless well of parental money had completely dried up forever. She shrieked that she could not be homeless, insisting that she had a certain lifestyle to maintain, and that raising her children in a cramped apartment was physically impossible for a woman of her superior social standing. Brenda, completely broken by the relentless sequence of absolute disasters, desperately tried to grasp onto the only identity she had left. She tried to be the comforting matriarch. Brenda took a step forward, her face etched with manufactured maternal concern. She reached her arms out, offering a tight, consoling hug to the daughter she had ruined her own life to protect. Brenda murmured soft, frantic promises, assuring Tasha that they would figure it out, that family always found a way to survive the darkest storms. Tasha did not accept the embrace. As Brenda leaned in, the golden child reacted with visceral, explosive disgust. Tasha raised both of her hands and violently shoved her mother backward. The physical rejection was incredibly forceful, sending Brenda stumbling over the cobblestones until she awkwardly caught her balance near the imported agave plants. Brenda gasped, clutching her chest in genuine physical shock, her eyes wide with profound heartbreak. The physical push opened the floodgates of Tasha's misplaced fury. She unleashed decades of toxic resentment directly onto the parents who had worshipped her. Tasha screamed that their disgusting obsession with status had completely ruined her life. She aggressively reminded them of how they had pushed her to marry Brad in the first place. She yelled that they had practically forced her down the aisle simply because Brad came from a wealthy white family and carried the superficial prestige they so desperately craved. Tasha viciously exposed the truth, claiming that she had noticed Brad's financial red flags years ago, but her parents had actively gaslit her into ignoring them entirely. She pointed her finger at Brenda, her voice echoing with malicious intent. Tasha shrieked that Brenda only cared about having a successful son-in-law to brag about at the country club. She accused her parents of intentionally looking the other way when Brad asked for massive loans, blaming their pathetic need to feel like elite investors for blinding them to the blatant Ponzi scheme. Tasha completely absolved herself of any personal responsibility, eagerly throwing her ruined parents into the fire to justify her own catastrophic failures. The perfect family facade, meticulously maintained through lies, stolen college funds, and relentless emotional abuse, entirely disintegrated right there on Kendra's beautiful beachfront driveway. Marcus stared at his eldest daughter, his mouth hanging open. He had sacrificed his retirement, his paid-off home, and his relationship with his youngest child entirely for the woman currently screaming that she totally despised him. The absolute worthlessness of his lifelong investment finally registered in his eyes. Realizing that her parents were truly irreversibly useless, Tasha panicked. The realization that there was no hidden trust fund and no secret escape route settled into her bones. She spun around, her eyes locking onto the only person left on the driveway who possessed actual wealth and absolute power. Tasha abandoned her rage, instantly pivoting back to the theatrical victimhood she had weaponized since childhood. She stumbled towards the front porch, closing the distance to the grand stone staircase. Tasha completely discarded her pride, her arrogance, and her lifelong superiority complex. She collapsed onto her knees at the base of the steps, directly in front of Kendra. The golden child looked up, tears streaming down her ruined makeup, her hands clasped together in a pathetic display of absolute submission. She begged Kendra to let her move into the guest house. She pleaded for mercy, desperately leveraging her children as emotional collateral. Tasha cried out that they had nowhere else to go, sobbing uncontrollably, as she looked up at the sister she had tried to aggressively steal from just 30 minutes prior. She clutched the bottom edge of Kendra's tailored trousers, completely broken, and delivered her final desperate plea. "I am your sister." The desperate, pathetic plea echoed across the cobblestones, an agonizing sound that temporarily overpowered the rhythmic crashing of the ocean waves below. "I am your sister." The words were meant to function as a magical incantation, a lifelong get-out-of-jail-free card that Tasha had successfully swiped every single time she needed to evade accountability. She knelt on the hard pavement, her hands clutching the tailored fabric of Kendra's trousers, fully expecting the forensic accountant to soften. She expected the deeply ingrained societal pressure of familial obligation to miraculously override decades of relentless, unapologetic abuse. She looked up with wide, tear-streaked eyes, waiting for the inevitable moment when Kendra would sigh, offer a forgiving smile, and unlock the doors to the luxurious guest house. Kendra did not sigh. She did not smile. She looked down at the 35-year-old woman weeping at her feet and felt absolutely nothing but the cold, analytical detachment of an auditor closing a fundamentally bankrupt account. She did not see a sister in need of salvation. Instead, the physical proximity of Tasha's sobbing face triggered a razor-sharp memory from a decade prior, a defining moment that had permanently severed whatever fragile emotional bond they had left. The memory played in Kendra's mind with crystal-clear high-definition clarity. It was the afternoon of her university graduation. Kendra had stood in the sweltering heat wearing a cheap polyester gown, holding a diploma she had financed entirely by herself through grueling night shifts and predatory student loans because her parents had stolen her tuition money. Tasha had arrived 2 hours late wearing a custom designer dress funded entirely by Brenda and Marcus. Kendra remembered standing near the campus fountain, exhausted but profoundly proud of her academic achievement, when Tasha had purposefully pulled her away from the celebrating crowd. Tasha had looked Kendra up and down, a cruel mocking smirk playing on her lips. She had flicked the tassel on Kendra's graduation cap and delivered a line dripping with unearned superiority. Tasha had laughed, stating that all those expensive accounting textbooks were a complete waste of time because a woman without a wealthy man to provide for her was inherently useless. That arrogant, condescending laughter from a decade ago perfectly overlapped with the pathetic, hyperventilating sobs currently echoing on the pristine driveway. Kendra slowly reached down and firmly detached Tasha's clutching fingers from her trousers. She stepped back, putting a deliberate physical boundary between herself and the golden child. Kendra spoke with a voice as calm and unforgiving as the Pacific tide. She told Tasha that the biological accident of sharing the exact same parents did not constitute a meaningful relationship. She stated that sisterhood required mutual respect, support, and basic human decency. 3 fundamental concepts that Tasha had actively despised for her entire life. Kendra ruthlessly dismantled the emotional manipulation, reminding Tasha of her own graduation day commentary. She stated that since a woman without a man was completely useless, Tasha should probably figure out how to survive without her fraudulent tech executive husband to protect her now. Tasha gasped, the color completely draining from her face, as her own toxic words were weaponized against her. She tried to reach out again, begging Kendra to think of her innocent nieces and nephews, frantically using her children as human shields to secure free coastal real estate. Kendra systematically shut down the desperate negotiation. She informed Tasha that her children were entirely innocent casualties of their parents' catastrophic greed. Because of that undeniable fact, Kendra stated that the children were more than welcome to go stay with Brad's wealthy parents across town, where they would be fed, sheltered, and kept safely away from the fallout of their father's federal wire fraud case. Kendra made it absolutely clear that she was not punishing the kids. She was punishing the adult standing directly in front of her. She leveled a stare so intense it forced Tasha to physically shrink backward. Kendra delivered the final undeniable rejection. She stated that under no circumstances would Tasha ever be allowed to step foot inside the guest house, the main house, or any structure located on the $4 million property. She absolutely refused to subsidize the lifestyle of a 35-year-old woman who had literally arrived 20 minutes prior, armed with a forged property deed, fully intending to steal her home and throw her out onto the street. Kendra pointed out the sheer clinical insanity of Tasha, attempting to steal the estate, failing spectacularly, and then immediately demanding to live on the premises for free. The absolute unyielding rejection broke the final string of Tasha's fragile sanity. The golden child realized for the very first time in her pampered existence that no one was coming to save her. She collapsed fully onto the cobblestone driveway, curling into a tight, pathetic ball, wailing loudly as the reality of her total destruction finally settled into her bones. Simultaneously, the heavy steel doors of the police cruiser slammed shut with a sharp metallic finality. The officers, having concluded their investigation, verified the forged documents, and fully secured their prisoner, had no further reason to remain on the property. The engine roared to life. The cruiser slowly rolled down the sweeping driveway, carrying the disgraced tech executive away toward federal lockup. The flashing red and blue lights faded into the morning sun. Near the open iron gates, the driver of the heavy commercial moving truck had watched the entire spectacular implosion from the elevated cab of his vehicle. He processed the arrests, the screaming matches, and the brutal legal revelations. He quickly realized the arrogant people who hired him were entirely bankrupt. Realizing he wasn't getting paid, he acted swiftly. He marched to the back of his truck, unlatched the heavy metal ramp, and aggressively dragged Tasha's expensive matching luggage to the edge. He dumped the bags unceremoniously onto the public curb, slammed the roll-up door, and sped off. The loud, grinding roar of the moving truck's diesel engine faded down the coastal highway, leaving behind a suffocating silence on the pristine cobblestone driveway. The silver luxury SUV remained parked haphazardly near the grand stone staircase, but it no longer resembled a chariot of conquering monarchs. It was now just a vehicle belonging to completely ruined people. Brad was gone, handcuffed in the back of a speeding police cruiser. Tasha was entirely broken, sobbing hysterically near the iron gates, her perfect facade permanently destroyed. Marcus leaned heavily against the hood of the SUV, his eyes vacant, utterly paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his impending bankruptcy. The unified front that had marched up the driveway just an hour prior to claim the beachfront property was officially dead. Into this void of absolute defeat stepped Brenda. The matriarch of the family, realizing that her husband's aggressive patriarchal intimidation had failed spectacularly, and her golden child's theatrical victimhood had been brutally rejected, resorted to the bottom of her manipulative arsenal. She had lost her wealth, her social standing, and her stolen prestige. The only weapon she had left was biological guilt. Brenda slowly approached the base of the grand stone staircase, her sensible shoes scraping softly against the gravel. She deliberately softened her posture, rounding her shoulders to appear small, frail, and profoundly wounded. She let a fresh wave of tears pool in her eyes, meticulously crafting the image of a desperate, loving mother trying to keep her family together during a tragic misunderstanding. Brenda looked up at Kendra, who stood tall and victorious on the sweeping porch. The mother's voice trembled with perfectly calibrated emotional distress, omitting the fact that she had arrived that very morning with a forged deed intending to render her youngest daughter homeless. She spoke softly, trying to weave a spell of maternal guilt. She begged Kendra to look past the anger and the legal technicalities, insisting that deep down they were still flesh and blood. Brenda placed a trembling hand over her heart and launched into a monologue about the heavy burdens of parenthood. She cried that a child could never truly understand the relentless sacrifices of a mother until they had children of their own. She claimed that every decision she had ever made was driven entirely by a desperate, unconditional love for her family. She pleaded for Kendra to show a shred of mercy, insisting that a daughter could not execute a foreclosure and evict the very woman who had given her life. Kendra watched the performance with the unyielding scrutiny of a forensic accountant, examining a fraudulent tax return. She did not feel a single pang of guilt. She did not feel the familiar heavy weight of childhood obligation that used to constantly suffocate her. She looked at the tears streaming down Brenda's face and recognized them not as expressions of genuine remorse, but as the last resort of a cornered predator realizing its trap had failed. Kendra allowed the silence to stretch, letting Brenda's pathetic plea hang in the salty coastal air until it felt incredibly cheap and hollow. Then Kendra systematically dismantled the entire maternal illusion with brutal, undeniable facts. Kendra spoke with a resonant, commanding clarity that echoed perfectly across the estate. She informed her mother that true sacrifice required selflessness, a concept Brenda fundamentally did not comprehend. Kendra stated that she remembered every detail of her childhood, and none of those memories aligned with the noble maternal narrative Brenda was currently trying to sell. Kendra initiated a forensic audit of her upbringing, listing the specific, undeniable data points of Brenda's lifelong neglect. Kendra looked at her mother's manufactured tears. She didn't need to recount the endless night shifts or the cheap instant noodles she survived on when her college fund evaporated. Brenda already knew perfectly well what those imported wedding orchids had cost her youngest daughter. Kendra stepped to the edge of the stairs, her voice like ice. "You didn't sacrifice for me. You sacrificed me for her." Kendra did not stop there. She brought up the holidays. She listed the specific Thanksgiving dinners and Christmas mornings she had spent entirely alone in a freezing apartment because her parents had decided to fly across the country to celebrate with Brad's wealthy family. She reminded Brenda of the time her car broke down in the middle of a brutal winter storm, and when she called for emergency help, Brenda had impatiently hung up the phone because Tasha was having a minor crisis about finding the perfect designer handbag. Kendra documented every instance where her fundamental safety and well-being were completely ignored in favor of Tasha's vanity. Brenda's manufactured tears stopped flowing. Her mouth opened and closed silently, unable to generate a valid counter-argument to the overwhelming mountain of factual evidence. The matriarch physically shrank back the crushing weight of her own documented cruelty, finally breaking through her impenetrable wall of denial. Kendra took one final step forward, standing at the very edge of the grand stone staircase. She looked down at the woman who had birthed her, her expression carved from absolute unforgiving granite. She delivered the definitive conclusion to their lifelong relationship, her words striking with lethal precision. "You did not sacrifice for me. You sacrificed me for her." The brutal truth of the statement echoed over the crashing ocean waves. Brenda completely collapsed inward, dropping her face into her hands, unable to look at the daughter she had ruthlessly exploited. Kendra did not offer a single word of comfort. She did not wait for an apology she knew would never come. She simply turned her back on the ruined family. She walked calmly and deliberately back toward the heavy oak doors of her sanctuary. She reached the threshold, her hand resting on the brass handle, and delivered the final term of their existence without turning to look at them. "You have exactly 6 hours to find $1.5 million." The heavy oak doors closed behind Kendra with a solid thud, severing the chaotic noise of the driveway from the serene sanctuary of her home. Inside the foyer, the air was cool, smelling faintly of citrus. Kendra walked purposefully through this corridor, her designer heels clicking against the imported marble floors. Elias followed closely behind her, his tailored suit unwrinkled by the morning's legal executions. They moved in perfect synchronization toward the sprawling kitchen that overlooked the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean. The kitchen was a masterpiece of modern architectural design. Pristine white quartz countertops stretched endlessly beneath sleek cabinetry. A massive center island carved from a single slab of veined marble anchored the room. Kendra moved behind the island and approached the built-in espresso machine. The familiar hum of the grinder filling the quiet room provided a stark contrast to the hysterical screaming that had dominated her morning. She moved with practiced efficiency, locking the portafilter into place and watching the dark liquid pour into 2 ceramic mugs. She handed one steaming mug to Elias, who accepted it with a curt nod. He placed his briefcase onto a nearby stool and took a deliberate sip, his dark eyes surveying the sheer luxury of Great Aunt Vivian's final masterpiece. They stood side by side behind the marble island, silent, drinking their coffee, while facing the expansive glass windows that made up the rear wall of the property. The layout provided a panoramic view of the coastal highway, the sprawling front lawn, and the iron gates. From this elevated climate-controlled vantage point, Kendra and Elias possessed front-row seats to the reality television show unfolding on the cobblestones. It was a silent movie of complete financial devastation. Outside the soundproof glass, Marcus and Brenda were engaged in a frantic, humiliating scramble for survival. The parents were pacing erratically around the silver SUV, their expensive smartphones glued to their ears. Kendra watched her father gesture wildly with his free hand, his face contorted in a mask of aggressive desperation. He was calling his golfing buddies, his country club acquaintances, and his former business partners, desperately trying to leverage decades of fake prestige into a massive unsecured loan. Kendra watched Marcus's shoulders slump time and time again as the men he thought were his elite peers abruptly ended the calls. No legitimate financial institution would ever agree to lend $1.5 million to a man whose son-in-law had just been arrested for federal wire fraud on his own front lawn. Brenda was faring no better. The matriarch was sitting heavily on one of Tasha's discarded suitcases near the curb, aggressively dialing relatives she had spent years actively ignoring. Kendra watched her mother's mouth move rapidly, undoubtedly spinning fabricated tales of a sudden family emergency, begging for cash transfers that would never arrive. Every few minutes, Brenda would lower the phone, her face crumpling in fresh despair as another bridge she had burned refused to offer a lifeline. Tasha remained curled on the pavement a few yards away, weeping into her stained linen dress while her parents desperately tried to bail water out of a sunken ship. The sheer futility of their actions was mesmerizing in a clinical way. They had exactly 5 hours and 40 minutes remaining before the digital foreclosure documents were officially filed with the state. Kendra took another sip of her espresso, the bitter warmth spreading pleasantly through her chest. She watched her father angrily throw his phone against the hood of the SUV after another brutal rejection. The panic was entirely self-inflicted, the direct result of their relentless pursuit of a lifestyle they fundamentally could not afford. Elias lowered his ceramic mug, resting it gently against the quartz countertop. He turned his head slightly, observing Kendra's perfectly composed profile. He had worked alongside Great-Aunt Vivian for decades, navigating the treacherous waters of corporate sabotage and ruthless family dynamics. He had watched her dismantle her entire biological family without shedding a single tear. Elias cleared his throat, drawing Kendra's attention away from the window. He asked her a direct, uncompromising question, wondering if she felt even a microscopic fraction of guilt while watching the people who raised her slowly drown in a sea of absolute ruin. Kendra did not answer immediately. She turned her gaze back to the windows, looking past the frantic parents pacing on the driveway. She focused her eyes on the endless rolling expanse of the Pacific Ocean beyond the iron gates. The water was deep, violent, and completely indifferent to the struggles of the people on the shore. She analyzed her own internal emotional state with the exact same objective scrutiny she applied to a corporate ledger. She searched for regret, for pity, for the familiar sting of daughterly obligation, and found absolutely nothing but a profound, liberating emptiness. She finally answered Elias, her voice perfectly even and entirely devoid of malice. Kendra admitted that society conditioned children to love their parents unconditionally, to forgive every transgression in the name of biological loyalty. She stated that for a very long time she had desperately wanted a mother who protected her and a father who respected her. But she realized a decade ago that those people simply did not exist. The Brenda and Marcus pacing on the driveway were strangers, toxic entities entirely consumed by their own shallow greed. Kendra turned to look Elias directly in the eye and delivered a haunting metaphor. She told the lawyer that she had mourned the tragic loss of her family many years ago, crying all the tears she would ever shed for them in cramped college dormitories and lonely holiday apartments. She took a deep breath of the citrus-scented air and smiled a genuine smile. Today was not a tragedy. Today was just the funeral. Suddenly, the serene quiet of the kitchen was shattered by a sharp electronic vibration. Kendra's smartphone resting on the marble island began to ring. The bright screen illuminated, casting a harsh blue glow against the white quartz. The ringtone was loud, demanding immediate attention. Kendra looked down at the digital display, her analytical mind instantly processing the incoming data. The caller identification did not show a local number. It displayed an elite area code associated with the most exclusive neighborhoods on the opposite side of the country. It was a number she had seen listed on Brad's fraudulent corporate documents, a number associated with generational wealth and unchecked privilege. The frantic scrambling outside the window suddenly felt entirely insignificant compared to the new threat actively buzzing on her countertop. The final boss of the morning's chaotic legal battle was attempting to breach the walls of her sanctuary. Kendra did not reach for the phone immediately. She let it ring, allowing the tension to build in the quiet kitchen. Elias stepped closer, his posture stiffening slightly as he recognized the area code. Kendra picked up the device, her thumb hovering perfectly over the green accept button. She looked at Elias, her eyes flashing with a cold, absolute readiness for war. It was Brad's wealthy parents calling to threaten her. Kendra did not hesitate. She dragged her thumb across the smooth glass of the smartphone screen, accepting the incoming call, and immediately tapped the speakerphone icon. She placed the device flat onto the pristine white quartz countertop, right between her ceramic coffee mug and Elias's locked titanium briefcase. The kitchen remained silent save for the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean waves outside the panoramic windows. The connection established with a faint crackle of static. Before Kendra could offer a standard professional greeting, a booming, deeply arrogant voice erupted from the digital speaker. It was Brad's father, a man who possessed the kind of generational wealth that insulated him from every consequence the real world had to offer. He did not introduce himself. He did not ask how Kendra was doing. He launched a full, unmitigated verbal assault, his tone dripping with absolute entitlement and unchecked patriarchal aggression. He aggressively demanded to know what on earth Kendra thought she was doing. He barked that he had just received a frantic phone call from a federal holding facility. His voice vibrated with a dangerous, barely suppressed rage as he commanded Kendra to immediately march down to the police precinct, retract every statement she had made, and drop the ridiculous wire fraud charges against his son. He spoke to her not as an independent professional, but as a disobedient subordinate who had temporarily forgotten her place in the social hierarchy. He dismissed the forged property deed, the fake shell company, and the stolen investor capital as minor misunderstandings. According to his deeply skewed reality, Brad was simply a visionary entrepreneur who had made a few aggressive business maneuvers, and Kendra was a hysterical, jealous woman, blowing the entire situation out of proportion. Brad's father did not stop at demanding the immediate release of his son. He pivoted to the financial crisis. He commanded Kendra to wipe the $1.5 million consolidated loan entirely off the ledger. He insisted that family matters should never involve private equity tactics, conveniently ignoring the fact that his son had built an entire Ponzi scheme by preying on her gullible parents. The sheer audacity of his demands filled the kitchen, his voice echoing off the minimalist cabinetry. When Kendra did not immediately respond with fearful compliance, the wealthy patriarch escalated his tactics from aggressive commands to blatant career-destroying threats. He leaned heavily into his white privilege, wielding his vast network of high society connections like a blunt weapon. He told Kendra that he knew the managing partners at every major accounting firm on the West Coast. He threatened to make a few strategic phone calls and permanently blacklist her from the entire financial industry. He sneered through the phone, promising to ruin her professional reputation so thoroughly that she would never balance a corporate ledger again. He promised to unleash a fleet of highly paid corporate lawyers to drown her in endless litigation until she was forced to surrender the beachfront property just to pay her legal fees. He demanded absolute obedience, giving her exactly 1 hour to fix the mess she had created. Kendra stood perfectly still behind the massive marble island, listening to the barrage of threats without a single flinch. Elias stood beside her, his dark eyes fixed on the glowing smartphone, a faint predatory smile forming on his lips. Kendra waited until Brad's father finally paused to take a breath, having fully exhausted his arsenal of intimidation tactics. She leaned slightly forward over the quartz countertop, positioning herself perfectly over the microphone. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a masterclass in cold detachment. She did not raise her voice. She did not express anger. She calmly informed him that he fundamentally misunderstood the situation. She stated that as a licensed forensic accountant, she did not simply discover a forged property deed. She had spent the last 6 months conducting a comprehensive audit of Brad's financial history. She explained that she had tracked every stolen dollar, every illegal casino wire transfer, and every offshore account he had attempted to conceal. Kendra delivered the devastating counterattack with absolute precision. She stated that she had already compiled a meticulous dossier containing hundreds of pages of bank statements, forged signatures, and fraudulent tax returns. And then she dropped the hammer. She calmly informed Brad's father that this comprehensive dossier had already been forwarded to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the Enforcement Branch of the Securities and Exchange Commission. She stated that federal agents were drafting the asset freeze warrants for his son's remaining accounts at this very moment. The booming, arrogant voice on the other end of the line suddenly vanished, replaced by a suffocating silence. But Kendra was not finished. She addressed the direct threats he had just made against her career. She pointed out that she had a highly credible senior estate lawyer standing right beside her, acting as a direct witness to the entire conversation. She clearly informed the wealthy patriarch that using his financial leverage and industry connections to threaten a federal whistleblower was a severe federal crime. She stated that if she received a phone call from her employer, or if a frivolous lawsuit crossed her desk, she would forward the details of this conversation to the federal prosecutor handling his son's case. She promised to add his blatant intimidation tactics to the active federal extortion file, guaranteeing that he would join Brad in a federal courtroom. She suggested that he focus his considerable resources on finding a good criminal defense attorney because his son was going to need one. The absolute silence radiated from the smartphone speaker. The wealthy, powerful man who had spent his entire life destroying his enemies with impunity had been neutralized by a single accountant. The sharp click of the call disconnecting echoed through the pristine kitchen. Brad's father had hung up immediately, terrified of implicating himself any further. Kendra slowly picked up her ceramic coffee mug. She took a calm sip of the dark espresso. She turned her head, looking at the seasoned estate lawyer standing beside her. She smiled a genuine victorious smile. Checkmate. The satisfied silence in the kitchen stretched on a stark contrast to the grueling passage of time that slowly suffocated the three figures stranded on the cobblestone driveway. The hours ticked by with agonizing precision. Kendra did not retreat to her study, nor did she attempt to distract herself. She remained in the expansive kitchen, treating the afternoon as a quiet, meditative vigil. She poured herself a glass of sparkling water, moving around the pristine white quartz countertops with the relaxed grace of a woman who had already won the war. Elias remained a silent, imposing guardian at her side. He had relocated from the center island to a sleek leather armchair near the glass, opening his titanium briefcase to extract a silver laptop. He typed methodically on the keys, preparing the final legal mechanisms of the trap Great-Aunt Vivian had so brilliantly designed. Outside the panoramic windows, the bright, unforgiving California sun began its slow descent toward the western horizon. The golden hour cast long, dramatic shadows across the manicured lawn, stretching toward the defeated family like dark, grasping fingers. The manic, frantic energy that had defined Marcus and Brenda's earlier behavior had completely evaporated. The aggressive phone calls had ceased entirely. There were no more country club associates to harass, no more distant relatives to manipulate, and absolutely no legitimate banking institutions willing to entertain their desperate pleas for a miraculous financial bailout. They had exhausted every single resource, burned through every ounce of their stolen social capital, and found themselves entirely bankrupt in every conceivable metric. Marcus the patriarch, who had arrived demanding keys and issuing threats, was now a broken, hollow shell of a man. He had abandoned his pacing hours ago. He now sat heavily on the very edge of the concrete curb, his tailored trousers collecting dust from the street. His shoulders were slumped forward, his head resting heavily in his hands. The smartphone that he had wielded like a weapon all morning lay discarded on the grass nearby, its battery completely dead, mirroring his own exhaustion. He stared blankly at the asphalt, unable to comprehend how his lifelong pursuit of high society prestige had culminated in him sitting on a public curb, waiting to be evicted by his own daughter. Brenda sat beside him, perched awkwardly on one of Tasha's designer suitcases. The matriarch looked entirely aged, the stress of the day carving deep, permanent lines into her face. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled from the coastal wind, and the manufactured tears she had weaponized earlier had dried into crusty, pathetic streaks. She was no longer spinning fabricated tales of family emergencies or begging for cash transfers. She was simply staring at the heavy oak doors of the $4 million estate, completely paralyzed by the terrifying reality of her impending homelessness. She had traded her daughter's future for a temporary illusion, and the devastating bill had finally arrived. A few yards away, Tasha remained in a catatonic state of shock. The golden child stripped of her stolen wealth and her parental safety net had curled into a tight ball on the remaining pieces of her luggage. She occasionally let out a soft, ragged whimper, but even her theatrical victimhood had run out of energy. The three of them formed a pathetic tableau of ruined entitlement, waiting for the inevitable executioner's blade to fall. Inside the climate-controlled sanctuary, the digital clock on the built-in oven shifted with a quiet electronic click. The bright red numbers flipped from 4:59 to exactly 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The absolute deadline had arrived. The grace period was now officially over. Kendra placed her glass of sparkling water down on the marble island. She reached for her silver tablet, the cool metal familiar and grounding in her hands. She did not rush. She bypassed the security protocols and opened her encrypted banking application, navigating directly to the specific trust account designated for the consolidated corporate and residential debt. The screen loaded, displaying the real-time ledger with stark, uncompromising clarity. Kendra stared at the digital numbers, allowing her analytical mind to verify the absolute truth of the situation. There were 0 pending transfers. There were no wire deposits. There was no miraculous influx of capital from an anonymous benefactor or a sympathetic relative. The balance remained entirely unpaid. The default was no longer a theoretical threat. It was a concrete, undeniable, and legally binding reality. She looked up from the glowing screen, her expression perfectly composed. She turned her head and met Elias's gaze. The seasoned estate lawyer was already looking at her, his hands hovering over the keyboard of his silver laptop. Kendra did not say a word. She simply offered a single distinct and deliberate nod. Elias returned the nod, his dark eyes flashing with a professional satisfaction. He looked back at his computer screen, where the ironclad foreclosure documents were already loaded into the state's digital filing portal. He did not hesitate. With a swift, practiced motion, Elias pressed the send button. The progress bar flashed across the screen for a fraction of a second before displaying a bright green confirmation message. It was done. The entire massive, high-interest reverse mortgage was completely foreclosed. The parents no longer owned their suburban home. They were now officially trespassing on property owned entirely by Great-Aunt Vivian's limited liability company, which was controlled entirely by Kendra. Elias closed the laptop with a sharp metallic snap. He looked at the forensic accountant, his voice quiet and deeply respectful. He stated that the paperwork had been successfully filed and recorded with the county clerk. He confirmed that the eviction process had officially commenced. Kendra took a deep, steadying breath, absorbing the absolute finality of the moment. The lifelong war was finally over. She had balanced the scales. She turned her back on the pristine kitchen and walked purposefully toward the front foyer. Her designer heels clicked rhythmically against the imported marble floors, echoing like the steady drumbeat of a funeral march. She reached the heavy oak doors, gripping the cold brass handle with absolute certainty. She pulled the door open, stepping out into the fading afternoon sunlight. The salty coastal breeze whipped around her as she walked down the expansive porch, descending the grand stone staircase, with the unyielding posture of a reigning queen. She ignored the scattered remnants of the torn trespassing notice on the cobblestones. Kendra walked all the way out to the heavy iron gate one last time to deliver the final verdict. The heavy iron gates of the $4 million beachfront estate swung open with a smooth, silent glide, revealing the utter devastation that awaited on the public curb. Kendra stepped through the threshold, the fading California sunlight casting a warm golden glow over her tailored silk blouse. She held her silver tablet in her left hand, the screen glowing with the undeniable digital proof of their financial execution. She did not approach them with the frantic, manic energy they had displayed all morning. She walked with the slow, measured, and entirely unbothered pace of a forensic accountant who had just closed the final chapter on a lifelong liability. Marcus, Brenda, and Tasha looked up as Kendra approached. The physical contrast between the two parties was staggering. Kendra looked radiant, powerful, and entirely in control of her destiny. The three figures huddled around the mountain of expensive designer luggage looked like refugees from a collapsed socialite empire. Their clothes wrinkled, their faces streaked with dirt and dried tears, their arrogant posturing entirely eroded by the crushing reality of their own greed. Kendra stopped a few feet away from her father. She did not offer a greeting. She did not ask how they were feeling. She simply raised the silver tablet holding the bright screen directly at eye level so Marcus could not possibly avoid looking at the legal documentation. The screen displayed the official state seal, the county clerk's digital stamp, and the undeniable confirmation of the initiated foreclosure. She spoke in a crisp, authoritative tone that carried perfectly over the rhythmic crashing of the Pacific Ocean waves. She informed Marcus that the deadline had officially passed, the grace period had expired, and the total balance of the consolidated loan remained entirely unpaid. Because of his catastrophic failure to secure the necessary capital, she stated that the legal mechanism of the irrevocable trust had been fully triggered. She told him that the paperwork had been successfully filed and recorded with the county. Kendra did not sugarcoat the reality of their situation. She looked directly into her father's vacant eyes and delivered the devastating blow. She stated that they no longer owned the suburban home they had lived in for the past 3 decades. The property now legally belonged to Great Aunt Vivian's limited liability company, which was entirely under her direct control. She informed them that they were legally required to completely vacate the premises within 30 days. She advised them to start packing whatever belongings they had left, because on the 31st day the local sheriff's department would arrive to physically remove them from the property. The absolute finality of the eviction notice finally breached Marcus's paralyzed state. The patriarch, realizing that he had truly lost everything, experienced one final desperate surge of toxic patriarchal rage. He pushed himself off the concrete curb, his legs shaking slightly from exhaustion. He balled his hands into tight fists, his knuckles turning white as he glared at the daughter he had spent his entire life actively suppressing. He tried to summon the booming, authoritative voice he had used to terrorize his household, but the sound that emerged was ragged, broken, and deeply pathetic. Marcus cursed her out. He hurled a string of vicious, desperate insults into the coastal air, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. He screamed that she was a monster, a cold, calculating sociopath who had intentionally orchestrated the complete destruction of her own family. He yelled that she had no soul, no heart, and no understanding of loyalty. He blamed her for Brad's arrest, for Tasha's ruined marriage, and for their impending homelessness, entirely refusing to accept even a microscopic fraction of accountability for his own catastrophic, greedy decisions. He spit the word monster again, trying to brand her with a label that would somehow alleviate his own overwhelming guilt. Brenda covered her face with her hands, sobbing loudly as her husband completely unraveled on the public street. Tasha did not move, staring blankly at the asphalt, her mind unable to process the screaming match occurring inches away from her face. Kendra absorbed the verbal assault without blinking. She did not raise her voice to argue. She did not defend her character or attempt to justify her actions to a man who had stolen her college fund to finance a fake tech executive. She simply let Marcus exhaust his final reserve of toxic energy. When he finally paused, panting heavily and glaring at her with venomous defeat, Kendra delivered the perfect counterstrike. Her voice was smooth, quiet, and completely devoid of any familial warmth. She looked at the ruined patriarch and replied with unyielding calm, "I'm just a childless woman enjoying her 4 bedrooms. Now get off my curb before I call the police for loitering." The profound irony of her statement hit Marcus like a physical blow. She had weaponized the exact insult Brad had used against her that morning, neutralizing their pathetic attempts to diminish her worth. She had proven that her solitary life was a fortress of untouchable power, while their desperate status-obsessed family dynamic had completely destroyed them. As if summoned by the sheer perfection of Kendra's final command, an Uber XXL pulled up to the curb. The vehicle's headlights cut through the fading evening light, illuminating the pathetic tableau of ruined entitlement. Marcus did not say another word. His rage evaporated, replaced by the heavy blanket of absolute humiliation. He turned his back on his youngest daughter and walked toward the open trunk of the vehicle. Brenda followed closely behind him, her shoulders slumped, her identity erased. Tasha dragged herself off the pavement, her stained linen dress dragging against the dirty concrete. They did not speak to each other. They did not look back at the estate they had tried to steal. They silently loaded their bags into the hired vehicle. They moved like ghosts, thoroughly broken, profoundly humiliated, and ruined by their own greed. 6 months passed, the relentless California sun rising and setting over the Pacific Ocean, systematically washing away the toxic residue of that chaotic morning. The swift, unforgiving machinery of the American legal and financial systems had executed their respective duties with absolute precision. The monumental shift in the family dynamic was no longer a fresh, gaping wound on a cobblestone driveway. It had crystallized into a permanent, undeniable reality. The consequences of their lifelong greed had settled heavily over their heads, completely inescapable and thoroughly deserved. The swift fall of Braden Hayes served as the most spectacular implosion of them all. His grand delusions of becoming a legendary tech visionary evaporated under the harsh fluorescent lighting of a federal courtroom. The prosecution did not even need to break a sweat. The meticulously compiled forensic dossier that Kendra had provided to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Internal Revenue Service served as an impenetrable fortress of hard evidence. Faced with hundreds of pages documenting his fake shell company, his forged real estate deeds, his staggering casino losses, and the luxury penthouse lease for his 22-year-old mistress, his high-priced defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. Brad stood before a federal judge, completely stripped of his tailored fleece vests, his condescending smirk, and his shield of white privilege. The judge showed zero leniency for his predatory financial crimes. Brad was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. He traded his panoramic ocean views for a concrete cell, forced to spend the next half-decade entirely stripped of the unearned authority he had weaponized against the world. Tasha, the golden child, who had spent her entire existence floating on a cloud of parental favoritism and stolen tuition money, experienced a terrifying crash landing into the real world. The moment Brad was convicted, she aggressively filed for divorce, desperately hoping to salvage her reputation and distance herself from his radioactive criminal record. However, the divorce proceedings only highlighted her absolute financial destitution. Because the startup was a complete fraud and their assets were entirely seized by federal authorities to pay back defrauded investors, Tasha walked away with absolutely nothing. The luxury SUVs were repossessed. The designer wardrobes were sold to cover legal fees. Without her parents' drained bank accounts to bail her out, Tasha was forced to enter the workforce for the first time in her pampered 35 years of life. She secured employment as a frontline cashier at a discount grocery store. She spent her days standing on her feet wearing an unflattering polyester uniform, scanning barcodes for the exact demographic of working-class people. She had mocked relentlessly at her country club luncheons. She moved her children into a cramped, poorly insulated apartment in a highly undesirable neighborhood. Her perfect, meticulously curated social media presence went entirely dark, her fragile ego completely shattered by the humiliating reality of minimum wage survival. Marcus and Brenda endured an equally devastating collapse. True to her word, Kendra did not extend a single inch of mercy. When the 30-day eviction notice officially expired, the local sheriff's department arrived at the suburban home the parents had occupied for 3 decades. The deputies stood by the front door, their hands resting on their utility belts, actively supervising as Marcus and Brenda loaded their remaining possessions into a rented utility van. The patriarch, who had violently demanded obedience, was reduced to carrying cardboard boxes under the watchful eye of law enforcement. They were forced to relocate to a tiny, decaying rental property on the industrial outskirts of the city, a harsh environment completely devoid of manicured lawns or neighborhood associations. Their social annihilation was absolute. The country club immediately revoked their membership, citing unpaid dues and the public scandal of their son-in-law's highly publicized federal arrest. The wealthy friends they had spent their entire lives trying to impress stopped returning their phone calls, erasing them from high society with ruthless efficiency. They spent their evenings sitting in a cramped living room, staring silently at the peeling wallpaper, suffocating under the heavy, inescapable knowledge that they had actively traded a comfortable retirement for absolute poverty simply to maintain a shallow lie. Meanwhile, Kendra thrived. The forensic accountant moved through her new life with the calm, unbothered grace of a woman who had successfully excised a malignant tumor from her existence. She finalized the legal foreclosure on her parents' former residence, hired a premium real estate agency, and sold the suburban property to a young, hardworking couple for a significant profit. She did not keep the money. Instead, Kendra channeled her professional expertise into a profoundly meaningful endeavor. She utilized the massive profits from the sale to officially establish the Great Aunt Vivian Memorial Scholarship Fund. It was a fully endowed, robust philanthropic trust specifically designed to provide comprehensive full-ride university scholarships to young African American women pursuing advanced degrees in finance economics and forensic accounting. She ensured that no brilliant young woman would ever have to work 3 minimum wage jobs or sacrifice her education simply because she lacked the financial support. Kendra sat on the expansive balcony of her magnificent Malibu beachfront property, the warm evening breeze gently lifting the silk fabric of her blouse. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the California sky in brilliant sweeping strokes of violet and gold. She held a crystal glass filled with a remarkable, incredibly expensive vintage red wine. She brought the glass to her lips, taking a slow, appreciative sip as the rhythmic, soothing sound of the crashing ocean waves echoed below. She looked out over the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean, breathing in the clean, untainted coastal air. She did not feel lonely. She did not feel the heavy, toxic burden of familial obligation. She leaned back into her plush outdoor lounger, a slow, genuine smile spreading across her face. She was entirely alone, entirely childless,